Okay, right. Welcome everyone. This is just a workshop. The agenda for the day is, first of all, we've got an LTP workshop that Melissa is running. That's 10 till 11. 11 o'clock we have Earl White, 11 through 12. Then we have a lunch break, and then 1 till 2 we have Brad Olsen. Okay. There are no formal apologies, but Susan has just asked me to note that Bruce and who is it? Bruce and Mike Pettit are not here. Now, Joe Davies-Colley has been invited to this along with Ange, and we've asked Joe to join us at the table. Okay. And Liz, you are online, right? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
And morning, everybody. I'm here, but I'll log off now. But if you need me to come on before 11, just get somebody to send me a text, and I'll log back on before then. I was just making sure everything worked.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thanks, Earl.
Okay. We'll see you soon. Cheers. Bye.
Okay. Right. Over to you, Melissa. Oh, do you want it? Yeah, sure. We don't normally at workshops, but no. Really happy to, Bill. Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, let's go for it. Go to Bill. Over to you, Melissa.
Perfect. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. Oh, what am I doing? Right. So yes, this is the first LTP workshop for 2025-34. Yeah, it feels like it hasn't been that long since we, since we, yes. Yeah, it comes around quickly. So, what we'll be doing today is providing contextual information to help set solid foundations coming into this next long-term plan. And as we go through, we'll be seeking feedback from you. We do want to keep it quite casual today. So yeah, happy to take, I guess, questions as we go through. And if there's anything that you'd like to explore further, we can look at doing that. So the format for today's workshop. So as I said, I'll cover off some of that foundational scene setting information between 10 and 11. And then we've got Earl White from Bancorp to advise us on our Treasury outlook leading into the LTP, which is obviously quite a significant piece of the puzzle. And then we've got a lunch break followed by Brad Olsen coming in to provide an overview of the economic outlook and how that might play out and impact the LTP and obviously our financials and inflation and the like. So in terms of what we'll be covering off in that first introduction to LTP section, we'll be going over the project structure, the approach that we've set out to this long-term plan, taken into consideration the feedback that we've received from you as elected members through the debrief session, but also the information that we received through the staff debrief sessions as well. We'll be outlining key challenges that we'll need to be aware of and just keep a watching brief of as part of this long-term plan. Covering off some of the key projects that we've identified to date that I guess will form a significant part of the discussion for this long-term plan. And we'll also be covering off key timeframes, particularly around workshop and meeting the schedule, and obviously your role as elected members as well. So this slide is really just presenting the project structure. So in the left-hand column, we've got what we call the building blocks for the long-term plan, and then the component parts sitting against each building block in the right. The reason that I'm showing you this is it will become familiar in terms of the progress reporting to SPMP. So we'll be doing monthly progress reporting against this structure, just so we can communicate to you how we're tracking against each of these component parts. But I think it's also quite nice in terms of setting out the magnitude of work that we've got and yeah, the size of this project.
Is that on here? Yes.
So this table is part of the memo that was presented as pre-reading for this workshop, and I understand it's in diligent in the LTP Workshops workbook.
Are we able to ask questions at
Yes.
this point? Yeah. I liked the structure and all that. However, I did feel that policy development was missing because, and this is just general policy, not just financial policies, because I can see us wanting to do some major policy initiatives, in that LTP timeframe. Just as an example, I thought there'd be some climate change policies and also possibly housing affordability. Yeah. And there may well be others that come up, but I just thought that's, like that kind of policy work, it can be a significant resource needed to drive it. Yeah. And so I just felt what you've got there under activity planning, it didn't quite cover it, I thought.
Thank you, Claire, for that feedback. I guess what is outlined here is really policy specific to the development of the long-term plan and the component parts of that. In terms of the policies that you reference, climate change and housing affordability, they would be incorporated within our programs of work, so within the strategy group. And if there is funding that is not currently available and required, then we would be preparing business cases. So already we've signalled, particularly in respect of climate change and potentially anchor institutions by way of examples, that there will be work that will need to be detailed and potentially that will then flow through to business case.
So we will see those business cases coming through, it's not just assumed that because staff have put it forward that it won't be a contestable process, or it will be a contestable process, or what policies we will develop and what we won't fund.
All business cases do go through a prioritisation process, but certainly in terms of the work program for the strategy group and team, those things are already captured. In terms of climate change specifically, the Governance Improvement Program Plan makes specific reference to a climate change strategy and policy. There is some funding available in this current year that we've signalled that we are going to be seeking approval to carry that forward. But thereafter, there is no funding. So for us to be able to give effect to that plan and undertake work led by elected members, there needs to be funding made available. So I think we would anticipate that there would be engagement with elected members by way of example, climate change with that subcommittee, and then through SPMP, and similarly with housing subcommittee in terms of, I guess, fleshing out that work. Thank you.
So just moving on. So the approach to this coming long-term plan. So no point throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we will be not starting from a blank slate, acknowledging that there has been a lot of work gone into the last LTP, and we'll be using that as a starting point and picking up from where we left off where it's appropriate to do so. So some of the things that we've identified where it's appropriate for us to do that is around things like our performance measures framework, the development contributions policy. So we've done quite a bit on that policy. We didn't get to the point in presenting that to you and the changes that we'd be looking at. But yeah, we've done quite a bit of work on that. And similarly with our infrastructure strategy and finance strategy. So they're just some of the things that we'll be, definitely picking up where we left off as part of the long-term plan. So one of the things that came out quite clearly from the debrief session that we had with you is the real need to, I guess, focus your attention on the matters or areas where it's most required. So it's not about doing sort of taking a gold-plated approach to everything, but making sure that we're having enough and really robust discussions on the critical issues. So yeah, that's the approach. There will obviously be other things that we need to cover off as part of the table on the previous slide, but we may just use as a bit of a check-in and seek your formal sign-off. So those, I guess the things that we've identified as being critical or major matters for consideration, as well as secondary matters, are identified in this table. So this is one of the parts of the presentation that we're, I guess, explicitly seeking for feedback from you in terms of have we got this right? So I guess just going through the table and the column on the left initially, we know that growth is a real challenge for our district, and we know that it's having significant impacts on our financials. So we're looking to do a deep dive on this and have a separate workshop on growth and to help set the scene and set the foundations to help inform your decision making, looking at what levers we can pull in that area to help alleviate some of those pressures. The second thing being renewals. So again, this was a sentiment that came through the workshops and the work that was completed in the previous LTP around whether or not we're appropriately funding our renewals in a way that's sustainable. So again, we're looking to, treat this as a critical matter and do a bit more of a deep dive and provide, I guess, more in-depth information, again, to help you make informed decisions with respect to our budgeting. Our financial strategy, again, this is something that we need to do a bit more of a deep dive on. We're in a financially constrained environment, so on and so forth. So that one's pretty straightforward. Significant projects. So there is a slide further on in the presentation which outlines what we've identified to be our significant projects. So these are initially being identified as high cost, high community interest. That's, I guess, the criteria, for lack of a better phrase, that we've put over those projects, but again, looking for your feedback. The development contributions policy, so acknowledging that we have done quite a bit of work in this space up until, I guess in preparation for the last LTP, so it's around making sure that we've got that right and we're having enough discussion on that. As would be normal, discussions around budgets and our consultation document is always something that we do need to spend a bit of time on with you. So focusing on the column on the right, secondary matters. I'll skip over strategic framework for now, I'll come back to it. So the significance and engagement policy and the groups of activities, these two things are relatively straightforward, and we've actually got two reports being presented as part of SPMP next week, seeking formal approval of those. So we're not really foreseeing much change for those two things. Our significant forecasting assumptions, Yes, we acknowledge that there will be things that change, but I guess if you keep in mind that we're not looking to spend too much time on it with you, we will still have a check-in. Similar with our levels of service. One of the things that we heard from you through the previous work was there is no desire to look at changing any of our levels of service. We will obviously check in with you, and we may need to adjust the program if that changes, but that's kind of where we've landed, that it's not something that we need to do a whole lot of work on for this long-term plan.
Yes. I mean, I think leaving them for the enhanced annual plan is appropriate, but possibly given the financial situation and all that, we should really be looking a bit more closely at the, a review of the levels of service. Not saying we're going to change any, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll note that. Yeah, so I suppose moving through the others, probably don't need to cover off in too much detail, but we will obviously be checking in with you on the remaining matters around activity management plans, financial policy, comms and engagement in terms of our approach, noting that the consultation document is a separate item. I've talked about before about our performance measures and our fees and charges. So that's not to say that things can't change. As I guess as an example, our fees and charges, we acknowledge that we need to do work in that area around making sure that our fees and the way we set those are robust and in alignment with our revenue and financing policy. The work that's required for that is probably more at staff level, but I don't see having, I guess, multiple workshops with you guys on that. In terms of the strategic framework, so this is something that we are seeking your feedback on. So it has been, a copy of the strategic framework has been put on the table in front of you. So it's not necessarily about the framework which sits on this page, noting that our vision of building connected communities, the community outcomes, and then obviously ahuaki, we are thinking that that will remain static. I guess the question for me is really around the external strategic priorities. So through the last long-term plan, we did have quite a number of workshops with you to review those external strategic priorities. And I suppose the question that I'm wanting to pose to you is, do you think that the environment has changed enough to warrant us to reconsider what those strategic priorities are? So I guess from my perspective, I'm a little bit, concerned's probably a bit of a stronger word, but I would like for us to have strategic priorities that enable us to pick up on, I guess, some of the concerns that you raised earlier, Claire, around our climate change work. Is there anything else like that, i.e. our renewals program, that we'd need to build into these or set more explicitly in our external strategic priorities? It's not to say that we couldn't give effect to those things or those concerns that you're raising through the workshops that we have outside of these priorities, but I guess I just wanted to test that with you if you're still comfortable with where we've landed, particularly around the descriptive statements in this table here. So we have got a workshop. So we have got a workshop planned, I think late June, to do more work on this with you, but I guess I'm looking for a bit of a steer from you as to whether or not you see this to be a secondary matter or something that we should elevate to be a major matter for consideration.
What's the contents of that workshop going to be?
Great question.
And that might answer you.
Yeah, so essentially what we'd be looking for through that, that strategic framework workshop would be a check-in on this. So staff are not proposing anything at this stage, but the question that I'm asking you is taken into so this was I think finalised in May or June last year. Do you feel comfortable that acknowledging all the change that has happened since then, particularly with respect to our financials and the information that we've provided to you, do you feel that that is significant enough or not for us to do a bit more of a deep dive on this?
Claire. Then Philip. Claire, then Philip. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. I would like a deep dive into it because I think things have changed. And actually, the biggest thing is our debt ceiling and the constraints that poses, because I think that means we've got to be far more, I suppose, targeted where we can do our capital investments and even our OPEX too, like especially if we're going to expand or contract and things like that. It doesn't quite fit in some of those. I don't know if it would be an easy way to just change one of those strategic priorities, those external ones, but I do think that we need to have a good look at that. And like there's quite a few things tied up with that. Like I think that we also need to have a really clear economic strategy, which, you know, it was pointed out in our hearings last week that, you know, we've got a 2012 one. And I think we've got to look at our different communities across the district and their economic prospects, you know, and understand what that's going to mean in terms of investment, whether that's dollars or resource or whatever. And another part of that is, does growth really pay for growth? Okay, because, you know, we're in this situation with our debt, and there have been other commentators around saying, well, you know, does growth actually pay for all of the consequences of growth, and should we be adjusting our DC policy to actually recognise that? You know, that, like those kind of questions. Yeah, and I would like to see all that sort of have an affordability lens over it as well, because I think that's what we're facing in the water space. We know what we need to do, but can we afford to do it? You know, like it's a lot of financial stuff tied up in there. Yeah, so I'd like to see how that can be put into the mix, and maybe that will, see a bit of adjustment in those external priorities.
Can I just jump in there just before Philip, because I actually have a contrary view. I think strategic framework is fine. We only did this in last May, and strategic frameworks, I don't think there's been a significant enough change for me to need to alter the strategic framework. I acknowledge everything you've just said, Claire, but I think they are adequately taken care of within the external strategic priorities. A lot of it can be dealt with in effectively planning and providing for growing communities. For me, that deals with all the growth sort of stuff, the DC kind of stuff. So I want to hear what everyone else has to say, but I would be slightly reluctant for us to get bogged down on a couple of months of reframing the external strategic priorities. I actually really like what the team have come up with here, and the split between critical matters and secondary matters. And if we get too distracted on strategic framework, I don't want us to run out of time to do some of this other stuff, which I think is really critical. Some of that critical list, last time, I don't think we did adequately, partly because we spent so much time on strategic framework. So, yeah, sorry, Philip, I jumped in, but it was in direct response to Claire.
I haven't got much.
And topic, and I agree with what you're saying. All of what you said, Claire, is actually like, it's important and has to be dealt with, but the external priorities, they should be kind of immutable, if you like. That the things that happen, if those priorities are correct, then they're dealt with. God, I'm getting myself really tongue-tied here, but yeah. So you know, and I think they are a really good, solid group there, and and the external things that happen, the financial situation basically is what we're talking about. It can be dealt with without doing a deep dive into them. Yeah, so I might put it way better, but
Philip?
Thanks. I haven't really got much, listening to everyone now, I haven't really got much more to add, and I think you've got it all covered here under strategic framework, and as Mike said, Monty said, you know, we've got to cover these other topics as well. So, yeah, so I think we're all good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll carry on cheering in the
Yeah,
meantime,
yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Look,
Thank you very much. I totally agree with you, Mike, and what you just said. One thing I'd just like to say, in the economically progressive, should we add an anchor institution, which we've adopted as a philosophy? And I just feel with the economically progressive, supporting thriving, sustainable economy, that we add in an anchor institution, which is part of what we have adopted as a strategic policy. Other than that, I wouldn't add anything more. I think we're covering everything.
Yeah, insane.
I'd just like to say, I disagree. I think that we are facing an unsustainable financial situation, and to do all this other work and say we're going to be doing all this stuff, but it'll be in year 11 because we can't do anything is really, yeah, not addressing the issue. But yeah, I'm just signaling it. Yeah, I'm not going to hold up the proceedings, but I do feel very strongly about it.
I think it's important to note that we do also have a financial strategy that I think we will be able to have a lot of the conversations that you're talking about, Claire. Yeah, in terms of talking about the anchor institutions, I guess that's the feedback that we'd be looking for as part of the workshop or check-in workshop that we'd be looking to have on the strategic framework. But yes, get your point on that one.
can I just, while you've got this chart up, I just want to, I really like this, okay, people, and the two parts of it that I was pushing for that are there are the critical major matters of growth and renewals, okay? Now, look, I'm agreeing with pretty much everything you're saying, Claire. It's just we're approaching this slightly differently. For me, in the last LTP process that ended up in the enhanced annual plan process, those two items I don't think we dealt with adequately. And it's been brought into very sharp focus now with our financial realities. We need, particularly on growth, to have a very strategic approach to growth. I don't think, I didn't feel it last time, okay? It was kind of like, this is growth, this is what we're doing. So I think staff need to bring to us a very strategic approach to growth so that we all understand where our growth CapEx is going. So what the growth is going to look like, how we're going to cater for it, and what that means for growth CapEx. To me, there was a disconnect in there. You go from, this is the growth we're looking at, this is this big CapEx spreadsheet, and I couldn't really understand how we got from there to there. I think that was a gap that we need to overcome, because if we can understand it, the people of Waipa can understand it. So that's what I'm looking for in growth, so a very strategic approach to growth. And renewals, obviously, everyone's aware of this infrastructure deficit that the country's facing. So I want us to be really good on our approach to renewals. So again, we understand where we're at. That's a starting point. We understand what needs to happen, and the translation from where we're at to that renewals CapEx spreadsheet, again, we understand the rationale for it, we understand the competing claims, and we understand the rationing decisions that have been made. I don't feel that I did last time, because it's quite hard to get from the state we're at to understanding that vast CapEx spreadsheet. So those two, yeah, great to see them there. Really pleased to see them as workshops, and I'm hoping that the workshops get to that kind of adequate level of depth that we can get that understanding, and therefore the people that we're representing can get that understanding.
Could I just jump in there? Like, I recall you saying that you didn't have an appreciation of how Waipa manages growth, and it's not so much like identifying growth cells in that, but it's the stuff that Gary's told us over many years, you know, that we break down our infrastructure investment into modular sort of components, so that we can do a small amount just in time and we can add it on and add it on, you know, and we used to have the policy where one growth cell had to be 80% full before we opened up another one. Like those are kind of like those management decisions or policies that we have, which are really important as well, you know, for all of our understandings. Yeah, and I'd really like any workshop to cover those kind of approaches that YPA's using, because that helps you understand, I suppose, the prudence or the high level control that we're trying to maintain, even though it's pretty uncontrollable at times. Look, Gary wants to.
Yes, so just in support of Mike, I mean, we used to have a very tight control on the back of 2050, Wipeout 2050, when we'd only open up a new growth cell when a previous one was 80% full. The government's policy settings around requiring to have 20% more than our high growth expectations ready to go really skewed that. And so I think you're right, Mike, we need a more strategic approach to the way in which we respond to that central government policy. And to an extent, it might mean pushing back because we simply can't afford that level of growth, because effectively it's robbing the community of its ability to do other things that it wants to do. So it's a conversation we need to have, and then we need to have that conversation with central government and the community.
Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And just on renewals as well, it's a critical area clearly. And Ken, my understanding is that we've been really focusing on the condition of our assets, which is a critical element of doing your renewals effectively or efficiently or both. So you've got a comment on that?
I think in terms of what we're doing in terms of asset condition and performance, etc., it's probably more appropriate for Dawn to comment on that. In fact, do you want to comment on that, Dawn?
Oh, tripping over. Sorry, apologies. Sorry, Andrew, can you just ask the question?
Oh,
again,
well,
just for
it's just,
clarity?
we're talking about renewals and being effective and efficient in dealing with them. And I was just saying asset condition is a critical element of that. And where are we at with that?
We've actually prepared a paper that we're going to bring to you on June 27th, which will outline all of that information in terms of how we establish criticality of our assets and therefore lead into that prioritisation. But equally, the asset categories for which we have good asset condition data, those that we have to improve in that area and the like. So yeah, we'll bring you a lot of detail around that on the 27th. Definitely a work in progress.
Any other final comments on this table before we move on? So we had a lot of challenges for the last LTP, but it wouldn't be any LTP without challenges. So the following slides are just basically setting out what we consider to be the key challenges that we will need to take into consideration and yeah, will have an impact on this coming long-term plan. So local water done well. The first bill, which covers water services and costs, will be passed middle of this year. So this will ultimately hopefully make it easier for CCOs to be established. The second bill will provide guidelines for long-term financial sustainability and economic systems for controlling water-related costs, and also provide for a new range of structural and financing tools. We're anticipating that to be introduced before December this year and passed middle of next year. So yeah, we are well across what's happening in this space, and it is just a case of keeping a watching brief with respect to water services.
Our wish that this area was going to be settled is just not going to happen, is it?
No. Similarly, there's been quite a bit of change with respect to resource management and the reform happening in that space. So the second bill will provide guidelines for long-term financial, reading the wrong part. So obviously the Natural and Built Environments Act and the Spatial Planning Act have been repealed, and we've reverted back to the Resource Management Act. The first of the amendments bills has been introduced, and obviously fast track consenting can be thrown in the mix there as well. We're expecting more legislation coming around middle of next year. So again, probably won't have too much of an impact on this long-term plan, but something that we do need to keep a watching brief on for the long-term picture, and particularly moving into the 2027 LTP as well.
Claire.
Yeah, so obviously there are challenges, but there might be some opportunities there. Like I was thinking with the resource management reform, especially fast track consents, we've got a lot of consents coming up, I'm sure. Like I've just been familiarising myself with the local water done well in a Waikato space. Is there an opportunity for us to say join with other Waikato councils and try and get a lot of our resource consents renewed through the fast track process in that 10-year window that we've got in the LTP, like stuff like that. Yeah, there was something else I came to mind as well. I think it's more to do with the Waikeria investment that's happening, and are there any opportunities for us there? But I think that's not so direct as the resource. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, like I'm not particularly in favour of fast tracking, but there might be some opportunities there.
But Claire, all of our big ticket infrastructure is consented, and I think probably beyond the 10-year period. So no need for us to focus on our big ticket infrastructure, but there might be opportunities that come up as time goes by. Critical to understand the fast tracking imperative is more about economic development than it is about the environment. So you need to sort of weigh that up when you want to go down a fast track process.
And I think they largely relate to projects of national significance or regional significance. So it's quite a threshold to get past.
Moving on to central government funding. So I think the big one in this space is around our New Zealand Transport Agency subsidy. So we don't get confirmation of this until August, which is getting quite late in the piece, but I guess the risk there is if our subsidy drops, we'll either have to pick up the shortfall in funding or relook at our levels of service in that area. So that's quite a big one that again we'll keep a very close watching brief on.
I mean, we do have the opportunity to have tolls, on our roads and other infrastructure, so we might have to consider introducing those. Yeah. Well, I'm just like, you've got to have an open mind, okay? It'd be remiss of us not to actually put it on the table. I'm thinking of a third bridge in Cambridge, actually. We could be tolling for that within the 10-year period.
So one of the other key challenges that I've identified in the next slide is around additional revenue sources. So that could be something that we look at. Yeah. Probably won't. Oh yeah, I'll leave it up there on that one. With respect to our financials, we know that we are in a very constrained financial environment. Yeah, not too much more to say there, but it's, I guess, just for us as we work through this planning process, having a real acute awareness of that and yeah, monitoring of that as we go.
I think it'll be really important as this process carries on, especially in the documentation that comes out, that these challenges are really carefully communicated and explained to the community. And it was done really well in the EAP document, but just that these are, explained in full so people understand these, because yeah, it's going to be important for them to be brought along why things are the way they are.
So in terms of our economic conditions, I won't say too much. We've obviously got Brad coming in the later part of the workshop to provide an update on the economic outlook. I guess if you read in the media, it's not too favourable at this point, but yeah, Brad will provide an update on that shortly. District growth and renewals, again, we know that these two areas are, in particular are key challenges for this long-term plan, and we've reflected that in the work program with a workshop scheduled for the 24th of June on growth, and similarly for a renewals discussion on the 27th of June. So it is all coming quite quickly with respect to the program. In terms of new funding and financing options, one of the tools that we are starting to look into is infrastructure funding and financing arrangements. So we have had discussions with other councils who have considered this path, and we've also met with Crown Investment Partnerships. Infrastructure partnerships, thank you, to, yeah, I guess do some initial thinking and understanding more about what this process would entail and what potential projects we could look at. But we will we'll provide more detail as part of the financial strategy workshop on, I think, the 6th of August. That one's planned for.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I'd really like considered existing debt and how we could move that off our books. Because in fact, that would help with our debt ceiling and our constraints there, because I'm kind of picking up that that item there is about new projects and new funding, but in actual fact, we could be looking at debt we've already got. Is its profile amenable to packaging into, yeah, one of these new financing vehicles that actually would allow us to move it off our books and open up some capacity for us?
Yeah, so through the chair, yeah, so councillor, that thought has certainly occurred to us as well, particularly in relation to one particular project. So yeah, so we are looking at that option. Yeah, I can give you that assurance, and as Melissa said, we'll bring back some really quite detailed commentary on this in August or whatever that date is. Yeah.
And just lastly, organisational change. So with the new chief executive coming in, we are anticipating that that will have an impact. We just don't know what that looks like yet. So just something to note there. In terms of our population projections, so we currently, along with our other future-proof partners, do use Nydia High. So it's based on 2021. There was a sense check completed by the University of Waikato in 2022. And they determined that that was still relatively fit for purpose. Unfortunately, the data coming out of census won't be available to really take into effect for this long-term plan. So we're not expecting it until October 2024, although I have just seen this morning that they have released very high-level projections, or that, I guess, that first cut of data, but it's not at a detailed enough level for us to be able to effectively use in our planning. So in terms of the major projects that we've identified to be considered for this long-term plan, some of these will be very familiar to you, as we had quite a number of discussions on them in the context of the last LTP and the enhanced annual plan. I won't go through the list, I'll let you read them, but essentially keeping in mind these have been identified as things that we will need to have a lot more, I guess, robustness around, and conversations with you, issues and options, yeah, just presenting all that information to you and making sure that we do have robust discussions around each of these projects. They, I guess, not like acknowledging that some of these project-based discussions may have taken place outside of long-term, I guess, outside of the umbrella of the long-term plan. So we're looking to pull those in and provide you with a more comprehensive picture of how this fits into the long-term plan.
Bill?
Can you just outline for me where the Kihiki Community Hub feasibility study sits? So we're going to be consulting with them now, but so they come up with an outcome. Where does that sit in these major projects?
So through the chair, acknowledging that this sits within Sally's area of responsibility, and Sally's not here, but my understanding is that the feasibility study is funded in this current long-term plan and is to be undertaken in this current financial year. Obviously that process is underway. We can't predetermine the outcome of that, but we are aware that that work is ongoing, is underway, as we were the feasibility study undertaken with respect to the Cambridge Library. So we can follow up with the community services team in respect of that, but it hasn't made its way into this list of projects, which I guess is work that is well advanced or is already being captured in part in previous LTPs. Yep.
Marcus and then Claire.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And also, does that include the Redoubt Kiki skate park work as well? Do you know or not, Kirsty?
We're just looking at the organisation's KPIs for next year, and one of those KPIs is to ensure that we have the Kiki skate park planned and located. That opens the door to the group that's advocating for that to crack on with their fundraising.
And the second question is, I think it would be quite good to, at least when we know what the census data is, to try and make use of it in this long-term plan, because at the moment we're relying on data that, you know, our towns and stuff are significantly different from 2021 to what they are now. And it would be really good to try and get some of that modelling and some of that data in to help shape our long-term plan.
Yeah, thanks. I like the list. I just wanted to add some possibilities, which were the Homes Garage proposal that's been put forward by the Tuamuru Community Board. Like, I know that Ange isn't here, but I'm pretty sure that they are wanting that to be considered. I'd like to see an affordable housing project in there. I don't know if that might be the Kihi, was it? You know, the one, yeah, that's going to be co-located with the skate park. And there's also the Mangahaya walkway at Nahanapuri. Yeah. I don't think they've actually put in a request at the moment. They have, so they've made a presentation, but yeah, they haven't. Yeah, so I just signal that that might be another project that might need consideration.
Through the chair, in recent conversations with representatives from that community group, they were determining whether they would put in a submission into the enhanced annual plan, and I think where they landed was that they would be looking to participate in the long-term plan process. Thank you.
And can I just follow from what Claire was saying with respect to the community board engagement? I think it'd be really good to touch base with the community boards on this list of major projects now. We've had pretty strong feedback, particularly from Te Awamutu Community Board, that they find it hard to get their ideas across the line, and this is the list they need to be on. So I think we should get to them as soon as possible with this for them to have some input, because at least if their ideas are on the list, they're in the game at that point.
Yeah, you've raised a good point there, Mike, and it's something that we haven't covered off as part of the presentation, but in terms of our communications approach, we do really want to pull the two community boards into this project a lot more and take them along that journey with us. Yeah, so it is something that we're very front and centre for us.
Bill, and I had someone over here, did I? Bill and then Lou.
The other one that reminds me, and I'm just looking at the catchment that a lot of these projects relate to, but in terms of Māori, there's the Papakainga outcomes and consultation that's required to occur and when that might be.
So through the chair, you're referencing the plan change 23 Papakainga, so that work is progressing. I think there has been some slowing down, or was some slowing down of it with resource changes within that district planning policy team. But we have James Fetto working with the internal team to progress that plan change. So my understanding was that there was engagement underway or to recommence with Mana Whenua and iwi in respect of that. I can follow up on that.
Lou?
Through you, Chair. I'm very, very supportive of what you just said, Mike, earlier on about community board involvement. I think, as I've already had this discussion with Joe this morning, I believe that the community board, if they are given the information at the early stages, can actually formulate a policy that'll work. I'm very strongly for using our community boards in a way that they can actually be a part of the discussion at the earlier stages. So I'm very keen on that. So I just wanted to support your statement 100%.
I think Kirsty wants to respond.
Through the chair, just to, I guess, respond to that and add to what Melissa's said, we've had conversations with elected members, Mayor Susan, Deputy Mayor Liz and Mike as Deputy Chair of SPMP, and with Lisa as part of the project steering group and developing up the comms and engagement approach to the long-term plan. That as part of the lessons learnt, we want to work in a more enhanced and collaborative way with community boards. So the approach that we're wanting to proceed with is to have community boards where we have workshop sessions. By way of example, we want community board chairs to be invited to participate in those. So hence the invitation has been extended today. We will follow up with Ange to see if she's not available, if it's possible that a deputy chair can attend. But we're also looking at direct engagement with the community boards as part of that approach.
So just on that, is there a positive action on this now to communicate this particularly to the Te Awamutu community board, seeing they're not here?
Yeah, we can definitely follow that
I
up.
think that'd be good to do like now, following this, yeah.
And just lastly, with respect to the last two bullet points, Ahuaki is yet to go through its formal consultation and adoption process, but it is really around making sure that we're giving effect to the strategic framework and where Ahuaki sits within that to influence this long-term plan. And with respect to anchor institutions framework, this isn't necessarily a project per se, but it's more around how we thread the sentiment and implementation of that framework through the long-term plan and the programs of works that we're planning for. And I guess, yeah, it is more around, not so much around what we do, but how we do it. So just wanted to make reference to those as well.
Just quickly on that, that's why I thought it was more a strategic issue rather than actually something to do. That's why that was anchor institutions, more a strategic thing. That it's an approach. It's not actually it's a philosophy of how we approach.
Yeah, so it will be treated a little bit differently to the other projects in that list. But it is around making sure that we are giving effect to it because it will have an impact on this long-term plan. So with respect to timeframes and workshop schedule, the workshops that we're proposing and the program is set out in the memo that was pre-circulated, they're a lot about setting the foundations for this plan and making sure that you are being provided with enough information, the right information at the right times to be able to really help you make informed decisions when it gets to that budgeting process. Budgeting will take place with you from October through to December. We can't have those conversations particularly towards the end of that period, without discussing consultation topics. So that will come through in the later part of that portion of the plan. And with a view to adopt the draft budget this side of Christmas. We haven't presented any dates post Christmas at this stage, but I guess for staff, we at least kind of know the rough deadlines of what we need to work to. The role of you as elected members, so we will be presenting the monthly progress reporting to the Strategic Planning and Policy Committee as we had done so through the last long-term plan. And this is just to help, I guess, help you keep on track with how the project is tracking, obviously noting that you are the governors of the project. In terms of the risk reporting, this will be reported through to audit and risk. I think the other point that I just want to note there is in the project management plan, Mayor Susan has been identified as co-sponsor alongside our CE. And as part of that, Susan will be invited to all the executive team meetings where long-term plan items are being discussed. So yeah.
Melissa, just on that, if Mayor Susan can't attend, could you ensure that Deputy Mayor Liz does? Because I was pretty keen for a governance set of eyes in that leadership team. I think it would add quite a lot.
And that's the conclusion of today's presentation.
We've just got Gary wants to say something.
Just one thing to be aware of is that we're in a fast-changing environment as government rolls out legislation. And by way of example, we expect to see the second tranche of legislation dealing with water CCOs late this year. So we won't know until that stage whether CCOs are, by way of example, tax-paying or not. What shape they might take. Critically, we're going to need to, if we adopt a timeframe, stick to it. And there are so many moving parts in this project that we've got to be quite dogmatic around if we're going to adopt on time, sticking to our program. And there may be things that we simply have to say, well, that's going to be an amendment to the LTP, or we'll deal with that in the LTP in 2 years' time.
Okay, and Claire?
Thanks. Just a couple of minor points that I have the chance to raise with your presentation. Firstly, could we have a separate LTP folder in our diligent?
We have.
I think we've got workshops, but what I wanted is one that's in resources or something, because what I find really challenging is as time goes on and stuff gets archived, or it might have been covered in a workshop, but unless you can remember the date of the workshop, you can't find it again, and it'd be really good if we had them all in one place that are not going to be archived, they're going to be available the whole time we're in this process. And if we could have reports or presentations, reference with a title so that we understand what it covers without having to go through all of a workshop, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I support that too, Claire. I've battled with that as well when you're trying to go back. And given the building blocks approach that you adopt, when a building block is signed, for that to be sitting in a LTP folder would be really great.
Yeah, and the second request, which I think you're probably going to do, is could we have as many workshops as possible as open, rather than excluded? Yeah, is that the approach?
So the approach is the workshops will be open unless we've got good reason under the Act to publicly exclude, but definitely hear your point, Claire, and we do want to really make sure that the PE workshops are an exception, not the rule.
Yeah, look, I really support that too, Claire, and I'll be constantly raising that point, okay?
So I'm just wondering if we've got, so this is a conclusion of that. So have we got Earl on?
Okay, thanks, Melissa. And you're perfectly on time. That is exactly 11 o'clock. Well done. And Earl, when you're ready, beam in.
Okay, sorry about that. I just had to say approved it being recorded. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, Tanakwe, Earl, yes, we can hear you well. We can see you as
Tanakwe,
well.
good to see you. And I think there's a slight blur, but I think it might be the lights in my office at home. So I can't do anything about that. So what I'll do now is I'll try and share the screen. And can you see the presentation?
I'll tell you when we can. Okay, all good. We can see the presentation now.
Excellent. Okay, so I might be looking to the side because I've got to look at the presentation, which I know. So can you still see it, or is it gone?
No, it's just gone.
Okay, yeah, I've got to have it over the screen here. That's fine. Okay, so it's over here. So I'll put it on presentation mode, which I'm not sure whether is that better or worse?
Look, it's okay. It was probably a touch better the other way, to be honest.
Okay, I'll go back the other way. Here we go.
Yeah, that's best.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so just to sort of so what I'll do is I'll give you a bit of background about what's been happening recently and why and what that means for interest rates. And then I'll go through some specific sort of analysis around where we think things are going and why. And then at the end, I've got some analysis around where YPAR is in relation to its current hedging and where it could be sort of in 12 months' time and what that means for the strategy we're looking at over the next 12 months, managing your interest rate risk as your debt increases. So if that sort of makes sense, I'll start on that. And please, any questions on the way through, I don't know what you've been doing, but I probably prefer them being asked as we go, because then I can probably address them appropriately. If you ask at the end, I might forget what I was talking about at the time. So that would be a disaster for me. Okay, so right into it. So since basically what's happening at the moment is that, we've had this big spike in global inflation. Central banks around the world have been battling desperately to try and get inflation under control. And to a certain extent, they have met that challenge and it's working. There's been a lot of pain everywhere because of that, because interest rates have had to go up quite quickly, with New Zealand the leading player in that. We were the first to tighten and have probably gone the furthest other than the US. But that's in play. And then what we've seen over the last 6 months, really, since the start of this year, is that global markets are jumping from, will central banks have to stay higher for longer? Or is there going to be a soft land in the US? Is everything okay? And that's really depending on the latest US release. Now, we've got geopolitical risks out there as well, and they sort of come along every now and again and dominate markets thinking, but really they're in the background at the moment. So the key focus is inflation under control, and when's the Fed going to cut? Now, at the start of this year, the market was expecting 1.5% of cuts by the Federal Reserve over 2024. So that was from 5.5% down to 4%. The market's now expecting 1 cut this year. And the Federal Reserve hasn't really shied away from that view. So the Federal Reserve is saying, yes, we'll be patient and we hope to cut this year, but it's data dependent. Now, the reason why we've had this big change in sentiment and market pricing over the last 5 months has been that globally, inflation is still a bit sticky. Here in New Zealand, non-tradable inflation is the issue, and that's kind of the issue everywhere. But central banks have generally got targets between 1% and 3%, 2%-ish, as let's say is the average to get inflation. And you've got to remember that a year or so ago, inflation in some places was 8 or 9%. So inflation has come down quite rapidly to 3 or 4, but it's that last little bit that's going to be tough. And that's really what markets are focusing on now. When will we actually get that last little bit achieved? The Reserve Bank met just a few weeks ago, increased their OCR track slightly from February. The market got all excited about it and decided that, other rate hikes were coming. The Reserve Bank pushed back from that quite aggressively and said, look, these projections are just projections and we may actually modify what we do. But did push out its OCR track for cuts until mid-2025. The market at the start of the year was pricing in nearly 1% of cuts this year in New Zealand. Now it's back to sort of maybe one cut this year. But the same as the US, financial markets expect 0.75 of cuts over the next 12 months. And the Reserve Bank is kind of saying, well, we might be, that might be a bit aggressive. In the background, so while this big focus for interest rates is on the US and obviously inflation data and employment and things, for New Zealand, the Chinese economy is very important. And it's also important from an inflationary point of view as well, because we buy a lot of stuff from China and sell a lot of stuff to China. Now, the Chinese economy has been pretty weak, and it still is very weak. And the main reason for that is that the housing market in China is effectively imploded. So that's spilled over into consumer spending. We're seeing producer prices. So China hasn't got an inflation issue. In fact, China's suffering from deflation currently. That's because people aren't spending. Unemployment's going up. The wealth impact of higher house prices has been wound completely out. So China's getting sort of like the Japanese malaise, which they've had for the last 30 years. People are worried about their jobs. They're worried about the cost of living. They're not worried about the cost of living, sorry. They're worried about the value of their biggest asset, their houses and things like that. So they're pulling their horns in relation to spending. That's having this domino effect, which means that demand, consumption, everything falls. The Chinese government is trying to sort this out. Just last week or a few weeks ago, they announced a $42 billion package to buy unfinished apartments or empty apartments, and then get the local districts to have those as housing for, cheap housing for people who can't afford houses, etc. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of these in these cities, there's tens of millions of empty apartments in China, and maybe people don't want to go to live there. So China's still battling. So what that means for New Zealand is that we are seeing solid demand for our exports, but the Chinese are pushing back on price in most markets. And we're still not seeing anywhere near the level of Chinese tourism we saw before COVID. So that's been offset by much stronger tourism from North America, for example, but that has an impact. Chinese international student numbers are falling. And, generally their demand for our products is predicated by, we ain't paying high prices, guys, sorry. So that's, the good news is that, well, if it is good news, I suppose, is that imports from China, the prices are soft, so that's helping the inflation battle. But so you've got this situation where most of the world's worried about inflation, but China's actually worried about deflation and really low levels of growth historically, and that's important for us because, as I said, they're our biggest trading partner. Okay, so here's our outlook. So we think that look, rates are going to be cut. There are cycles. We're at the peak of the cycle. How long this peak lasts for? Hard to tell. The Reserve Bank is going to err on the side of caution. Because if we look back, it was only a few years ago, and I probably presented to you guys, and hopefully I said at the time that it was madness. People were talking about interest rates in New Zealand going negative. It was just ridiculous, some of the stuff that was coming out a few years ago. So we had this massive decline in interest rates. We had this massive amount of stimulus from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, buying government bonds and printing money, and from the government. And a lot of that, in the COVID times, it was a great result. A lot of money was pushed out in the economy to save a lot of small businesses in New Zealand when COVID first hit. But the printing presses didn't get turned off. Oops. And unfortunately, the printing presses and the money that was printed didn't actually be spent on stuff like infrastructure, hospitals, schools, pipes, etc., etc., etc. So that's why we're in this sort of situation. And the Reserve Bank is worried that it can't, if it eases too early, inflation is going to pop up again. So it's going to go probably longer than it should theoretically, because it cocked up the easing cycle so badly. Lots of other central banks did as well, so it's not by itself in that, but that's underlying why they're very nervous about getting the market to get too excited about rate cuts. Now, they're projecting mid-25. We think they'll probably go a little bit earlier than that, but in the big scheme of things, probably not too much earlier. And we still see a terminal cash rate when they start the easing cycle around 3-ish. We don't see interest rates going to 2, 1, 0. Central banks aren't going to put interest rates to 0 again, ever, while these guys are alive that saw the last one, unless the world goes into some kind of 1920s depression. And even then they probably won't do it because it didn't actually fix things in the long run. So, what we've got to do when we look at interest rates is get rid of this, just sort of wipe the hard drive around COVID and 0 interest rates and 1% interest rates. They were a one in a lifetime event. Interest rates are getting back to normal, right? In the big scheme of things, interest rates averaged about 3, 4, 5%. If councils could borrow at 5%, it was happy days. Now we're borrowing at 5%, the world's ending. Unfortunately, if we've got an inflation target of 2 to 3%, we've got New Zealand pays a risk premium because we borrow more, we spend more than we earn, so we've got to borrow internationally to make up the deficit. So if you put all that together, the average interest rate in New Zealand's got to be sort of 3 or 4-ish. So term rates have to be 3, 4 or 5-ish. So interest rates around 4% aren't unusual. It's just that because we've had this exceptional once in a lifetime circumstance, hopefully, for my lifetime anyway, when COVID, we've all suddenly thought that interest rates at 0 are normal. They're not. So moving forward, we need to get rid of that as well. But the big problem with the Reserve Bank is sticky non-tradable inflation. Because if you look at this chart here, so these are sort of the factors that probably affect monetary policy, and we try and look at them and go, which ones are down, which ones are neutral, and which ones are saying interest rates should be going up. Now on that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14 factors, only one is implying interest rates should be tightened. That's non-tradable inflation. There's a few that are neutral, and those neutral ones are probably pushing towards cut. Overwhelmingly, all indicators most indicators are saying these guys should be cutting interest rates. And in normal times, who knows what normal times are now, central banks would be, and the Reserve Bank would be signalling aggressive rate cuts. But that non-tradable inflation thing is the problem. And at the end of the day, the Reserve Bank's mandate is to get inflation into its target. It's got nothing else. It's lost its employment mandate, and unemployment's actually relatively okay at the moment, but it's getting worse quite quickly. But so that's the dichotomy we have. We have a domestic market which is crying out for interest rate relief. We've got a structural situation where it can't happen.
Hey, Earl, got a question.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. And then Andrew, is it?
Yeah, Earl, Claire St. Pierre here. I'd just love you to give us a bit more detail about what non-tradable inflation is.
I'm just about to get on to that. So,
okay, great.
Next question, there was another one too, wasn't there? Oh, okay. Right. So here's how inflation's made up, right? So inflation is made, so the grey line is the Reserve Bank's target, 1 to 3. And as you can see, they spent most of 2011 till 2017, 18 at or below target. So they were doing a bad job. Inflation was too low. They were desperately trying to get inflation up, and then along comes COVID and it all changes. So, but there's two factors, there's two parts of inflation, tradable inflation and non-tradable. Now, tradable is the doing part of the economy. So that's like input costs. Your input, we're buying oil, we're buying cars, we're buying washing machines, we're buying machines for our factory, we're buying fertilizer, all those kind of things. They're impacted by international prices and the exchange rate. So that's tradable inflation. That goes into the tradable side of the economy. Non-tradable inflation is effectively parts of inflation that aren't sensitive to the exchange rate or interest rates. For example, insurance, rental costs, housing costs, input building costs for houses. I'm not talking about house prices. I'm talking about input costs relating to housing. So you've got the cost of building houses and you've got rental costs. Council rates is a big part of non-tradable inflation. Government charges are non-tradable inflation, including tax increases on cigarettes and tobacco. They flow through to non-tradable inflation. So the problem with non-tradable inflation is it's effectively insensitive for long periods to changes in interest rates and the actual outlook for the domestic economy. but it's an important part of what the Reserve Bank observes. So if you go back and look at that graph in 2011 to 14, as you can see, non-tradable inflation was up at the top of the band. Tradable inflation was negative. So we had inflation outcomes, you know, in or below the band. So historically, New Zealand's non-tradable inflation has been much higher than tradable. And the issue we have now is that non-tradable inflation is currently around about 5%, and tradable inflation is heading south very quickly towards zero. So what's happening is you can probably join the dots, because non-tradable inflation isn't going to fall quickly because interest rates go up or because the economy's slowing. They're going to have to get tradable inflation down quickly. So the domestic economy has to slow more. So unless insurance companies cut their prices, unless rate increases that are going to come alive on 1 July are all reversed, non-tradable inflation is going to be a problem for a while yet. So that's why the Reserve Bank is going to continue to squeeze a domestic economy which looks as though it's in trouble already. That's what we face over the next 12 or so months. It's not a pretty situation, but it does mean that at some stage interest rates are going to have to come down because they're going to have to react, because they can't just have the domestic economy implode. They won't do that. At some stage, they will have to acknowledge the weakness of the domestic economy. They can't just continue to squeeze it because, you know, that's got long-term ramifications for growth and stuff. And having said that, their current projections are that we get inside the band relatively quickly later this year, and we stay there. So that's assuming non-tradable inflation falls to below 4%. Now, hopefully it will, but that's something they're going to have to worry about. So as you see here, here's the non-tradable inflation graph. And so in February, they were thinking it was going to fall quite quickly down towards 3% and then sort of edge up. Now they're saying, oh, it's going to fall lower. It's going to actually fall lower than we think, but it's going to take a bit longer. Now, as I said, the major impacts currently are rates, insurance, housing costs, and the big one really is taxes on cigarettes and tobacco. Now, typically, automatically, the price of cigarettes and the price of alcohol go up. You know, there's an ongoing adjustment, and that's a big part of non-tradable inflation. Now, clearly, that's not interest rate sensitive, is it? Demand is, but the price isn't, because those tax increases, if people don't buy it, it doesn't matter. The price is still higher. So you know, I'm sort of probably overemphasizing this, but non-tradable inflation is really the concern. And until we get that under control, the Reserve Bank is going to be pretty aggressive still. And that's why the Reserve Bank is sitting pat. It's saying it keeps on pushing out the timing of when it's going to cut rates because it doesn't want interest rates to fall quickly in the near term, because that could upset its ability to get in target, because non-tradable inflation is going to be slower to fall than what we would hope. Now, the banking sector is much more aggressive. You know, we're talking the most aggressive is BNZ says it's going to be down to 4% by not nearly in just over a year's time, whereas the Reserve Bank saying, well, it's not going to probably have moved. And then you've got ANZ, the perpetual bears, who sort of darkened their copybook by calling two hikes a few meetings ago and getting it completely wrong. But they're much less aggressive around cuts. So in general terms, bank economists see rates falling quicker than the Reserve Bank is projecting. And there can be, you know, some you can sort of support that in some ways, because we know the Reserve Bank is playing this game. It's scared that once it opens the door slightly, everybody's going to rush through and rate cuts and interest rates are going to fall quite quickly. And we see that in history. Once central banks say, oh, we're going to cut, markets preempt. Markets don't sit around and go, oh, they're cutting in 6 months. We'll wait. We'll do nothing till then. Markets react immediately on information. So, you know, whether those projections are right or not, well, who knows? And futures market pricing, this is actually financial pricing. So these are bank economist projections, so there's no money involved here. These are actually markets. You can actually trade in these. So if you think that the cash rates in New Zealand is going to be lower than 5% in 6 months' time, you can trade, you can take a position if you want to, and make some money if you're right, or vice versa. But so internationally, markets are thinking interest rates are going to drift lower, but it's going to take some time. Australia's a bit of an outlier, but the reality is they didn't hike as much as us in the US, for example, so they're probably going to sit for a little bit longer. But in general terms, the outlook is that rates are going lower. But guess what? This has been the outlook for 12 months. And if we went back 12 months ago, they'd be saying our rate hikes are happening in 12 months. Sorry, rate cuts happening in 12 months. Well, we've got there and they've just pushed out the timing. That's what's been happening. But how good are projections? So, should we just throw a dart? So what this graph is, so the orange ones are at a point in time the Reserve Bank projects the cash rate 18 months out. So as you can see at the start of this graph, back in 2002, the cash rate was 4.75. And at that time, the Reserve Bank was projecting that the cash rate in 18 months' time would be 7. It was actually 5. Oops. Back in 2008, the cash rate was 8.5. The Reserve Bank was projecting it going higher. Then they thought it might fall to around about 7. It was actually down at 3.5. Then at that time, they were saying, oh, she's going up for quite a while. They were saying it was going back to 6, and it stayed at sort of under 3 for quite a period of time. And as you can see, during COVID, they were projecting that rates were going higher, but until sort of late last year, early this year, their projections of where the cash rate were going were much less than now. So as you can see, projections, sometimes they get the direction right, but really, if you're running your risk management or running your budgets on projections of interest rates by anybody, it can be a bit tortuous. So, projections are interesting. You've got to have a view on things. You've got to, take that into account when you're managing risk. But, bank economist projections and the Reserve Bank projections they're always wrong. It's just how wrong things are, unfortunately. As I say to people, if I knew what the cash rate was going to be in 6 months, I'd be probably calling you guys from my 300-foot super yacht in Bermuda, but I probably wouldn't be calling you because I'd be too busy deciding whether or not my new Learjet was being delivered or not. Because if you knew what was happening in financial markets in 6 months' time, yeah, that would be a pretty powerful tool to make a lot of money. Unfortunately, nobody knows where anything's going to be in the future. We just have to manage risk within a framework and do our best. Okay, so what does that mean? It sort of means, if you look at this, rates aren't going down for a while, right? Because, non-tradable inflation is sticky. Okay, we get that. But why? Okay, are rates going to go down at all? That's a legitimate argument. Are we kidding ourselves? Are rates going to stay here for a long time? Well, maybe, but that's a pretty low probability, we think, because you look at this stuff, right? So here's the Reserve Bank's latest projections around wage inflation. So in February, they were saying wage inflation was going to fall slowly from 4 down towards 3. Now it's going down to 2. So what? And this is clearly what's happening in the workforce. The inability to get staff has gone from like a year ago, all our clients were saying the difficulty to get staff is our biggest problem. Now they're saying the ability to make sales is our biggest problem. So the Reserve Bank is acknowledging that wage growth is reversing quite quickly. Now that's good for inflation, right? And that's starting to get towards recessionary. That kind of decline is, implying recession, which is what they probably need to engineer to get inflation under control at this stage. And here's their surveys of firms. This is a QSBO survey. As you can see, back not that long ago, labour was by far the biggest concern. It shot up from being, it's a bit of a concern to, it's the overriding concern. So concerns about labour are now back to historical averages or lower. Most other things are, capital is what it is, materials. The cost of materials is much less of a worry now because a lot of those things have worked through the system. But as you can see, orders, i.e., can I actually make sales, is the biggest worry now. And you're starting to get to levels during COVID. And, 2008 to 14 in New Zealand wasn't a great time. Going into the global financial crisis, going into sort of COVID, our economy was slowing anyway. So, you know, so that sort of, you know, shows that things are slowing down quite quickly. That's quite a big move. And then you look at, you know, you can see sort of things you can sort of touch and feel rather than just surveys. So this is building construction, which is, you know, has gone up. Obviously, there was a huge drop during COVID, and then it's starting to recover again. But now it's starting to flatline and go sideways. Look at concrete production collapsing. You know, down 4.9% in the last quarter and down 12% over a year ago. Now, if you're, as everybody knows, if you're building anything, be it a house, a milking shed, a commercial building or whatever, or putting new roading in, you use a lot of concrete. So if concrete production's falling like that, that means somebody somewhere ain't ordering it. So, you know, construction is slowing quickly, and we know that. So that's another sign that, you know, demand is pretty weak out there. The good news is that we're starting, you know, our clients that are spending on infrastructure, they're seeing significant declines in quotes. You know, the cost of doing stuff is dropping very quickly because organizations now are realizing maybe they've got to price these things just to keep their workers in a job and get things done. The days of just going, oh, we'll price it at X, and if we don't get it, we don't care because there's another 20 jobs in the pipeline, that's starting to disappear. So all these clouds have sort of a little bit of a silver lining sometimes. Okay, now in relation to the, you know, we use dairy as a surrogate for the agricultural sector, which is, you know, it's kind of okay because it's our biggest export. Tourism still hasn't caught up yet. Now, what this shows is, so the blue line are dairy prices. This is the ANZ do an index, which is effectively, you know, an index of the basket of milk products we export, and the red line is the US dollar. So as you can see, over the last 10 years, and then we've put regression lines on those, which are just best fits. They give the trend, right? So if you look at the Kiwi dollar, in the last 10 years, the trend's been down. So it's fallen from those ridiculous levels near 90 cents when, you know, things were a bit crazy. And it's been drifting lower, quite frankly, since then. And it's around about 60 cents, just over 60 cents currently. So the Kiwi dollar's been falling. At the same time, dairy prices have effectively, give or take a bit of noise, have been going higher. Now, they've dropped in the last, you know, we had sort of surge in prices, again, COVID linked when the Chinese massively stocked up because they're worried about supply concerns. But in general terms, the dairy price is higher than average. So the average is 270 over the last 10 years, and it's currently sitting around about 320, let's say, so it's higher, whereas the Kiwi's average is nearly 68 cents, so well below it. So theoretically, if you've got a weaker currency and you've got higher prices, that's happy days for exporters, right? So dairy farmers should be buying lots of apartments in Tauranga, buying new utes, revamping the farm, putting on lots of fertilizer and having long holidays. The big problem is that the cost side's not shown in that graph, is it? The cost of actually producing your milk is going up quite a lot. So it sort of means that New Zealand really needs a lower currency than historically has been the case, just for farmers in our export sector to make a buck. And that means that higher interest rates, if they started to push the Kiwi up too much, could be damaging as well. So you've got these, you know, if other countries start to cut and we sit here and the Kiwi dollar appreciates, suddenly the export sector, which is doing a bit better than a lot of the domestic economy, is in trouble. So, you know, so there are some serious risks out there still, you know, and that's the problem. If the Reserve Bank leaves rates too high too long, it actually really damages the export sector because, you know, that could lead to the currency going up. And based on this, to actually make money like we used to, either dairy prices have to be at record highs, for example, log prices have to be at record highs, all our exports have to be at record highs, or the Kiwi has to be lower. Now, I'm not sure whether globally growth is strong enough so our export prices will all be at record highs anytime soon. And then if we look at, just look at, you know, what's happening. So consumer confidence is at recession levels, right? We had a bounce after the election. Well, that didn't last long. Consumers are doing it tough, you know, so again, you know, and these aren't sort of, oh, it's a bit rough, you know, but it's not the end of the world. These are historical lows. Consumer confidence as near all-time lows. It's as low as it was during the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So things are tough for consumers. And this is reflected in retail spending. So you see retail spending here in New Zealand. So the first one, so you've got retail spending and value is going sideways and volumes dropping quite dramatically. So you basically, whereas in Australia, the value is still edging up and volumes are holding in there. So Australia's a little bit better than us. But, when you've got 140,000 immigrants and you've got inflation of 6, 7, 8%, the value should be going up. So people are buying less because they just can't afford to. People are focusing on the need to haves rather than the nices now. And that's retail. New Zealand is really struggling. The retail sector and hospitality sectors are under pressure. There's no doubt about that. And this is these are credit card. This is that graph just in more detail. So as it shows, volumes are falling quite dramatically. And as I said, this is despite a population up 2.5% over the same period. And again, this is card spending from Stats New Zealand. So as you can see, credit card spending sort of flatlining, right? And starting to fall quite dramatically. So, per capita spending is falling quite a bit. People are spending less because they have got less to spend, because they've got to pay the rates, they've got to pay the fuel bill, they've got to pay for their rent, they've got to pay for this, they've got to pay for that. They have to pay for the things they have to pay. They can't afford to be spending on luxuries. So the retail part of the council area is under pressure, and it will be under pressure for a while yet. And here's immigration, so isn't immigration, this was the John Key's mandate, mantra was you have lots of immigrants and the economy grows. Well, we found out that was rubbish, because all was happening was we're having more people, GDP was not going up as much, and we actually all get poorer. So GDP per capita has been falling for a long time. So we've had, say, 600, 700,000 people over the last 5 or so years, or whenever it was, or 10 years, let's say, and our GDP per capita is going backwards. And we haven't been building hospitals, haven't been building roads, haven't been building schools, haven't been doing that stuff. So you get this sugar rush from headline GDP growth, but as a country, we're actually getting poorer and our productivity gets worse. So higher levels of immigration aren't going to be a magic bullet for the current weakness in the domestic economy. And that's shown, this is starkly shown in that chart. Immigration is strong and all the domestic metrics are looking weak. So immigration isn't going to get us out of the trouble, that's for sure. We've got to think of something else. And interesting, if you look at the migrant split, so this is March 19, March 23, and March 24. So as you can see, since in the last year, there's been a huge surge in immigrants from India and the Philippines, and to a lesser extent China. But the worry is that a record number of New Zealand citizens are leaving. So these aren't high value immigrants, right? We're not getting immigrants pouring in that are buying new houses, new cars, new boats, building businesses, stuff like this. These are people that are battling. And, you read in the paper, these are the ones that are getting exploited by not being paid the minimum wage and, not getting, all this kind of stuff. So there's some structural problems with this, but this immigration mix is not helping the domestic economy recover. In fact, it's a drag on it, because they're probably having to have government subsidies and things like that. These people aren't going out and buying houses, right? I think, there was a chap, Tony Alexander, used to be a BNZ economist, and he's now sort of linked to real estate places and stuff. And, 6 months ago, house prices were going to 8% this year because immigration's high, so people buy houses. Now the tune is, house prices are probably drifting back a bit. They don't sort of mention, we got that completely wrong with immigration. But immigration is different. It's not going to be the magic bullet. So we're going to have to do other things. And then, so if you put all that together, interest rates should be going down. But I go back to earlier, non-tradable inflation is not playing the game. So the Reserve Bank isn't going to do it in the short term. The good news is, here's 10-year government bond rates, New Zealand, US and Aussie. Looks as though they topped out late last year. So our 10-year rate got to 550. It's currently around 460. Doesn't seem to want to go much above 5. So the top's in, but we're going sideways. Would have been nice if the top was in as we're down at 3.5% now, but guess what? That hasn't happened. So we're pretty relaxed that, that the top in interest rates this cycle has been seen, but we're not so confident about when they will actually get down to levels which are probably more normal in a cycle like we're seeing. That's going to take a bit longer. So, here's a graph of the 5-year swap rate, which is the base rate for 5-year borrowings. Again, it's been falling for a while now, but still hasn't broken through that long-term uptrend. So, and it spiked up a bit the other day on the back of the Reserve Bank. So, again, sideways at best. So we're not going to see some interest rate relief in the short term, but it will happen. We expect this rate to go back to sort of high 3s at some stage, from mid to high 4s. So there's going to be a 1% decrease in floating and fixed interest expense at some stage in the next 2 or 3 years. But, you've got to just manage risk that you see in front of you. So you can't be expecting it over the next 2 or 3 months, that's for sure. And here's the main reason, because global CPI prints aren't quite there yet. As you can see, inflation globally has fallen quickly from December. Like in the UK, it was up at sort of over 10%. It's now down it's under 3 now. But it's going to be that last little bit getting into the sort of 1 to 3% range, which is going to take a bit longer. And they're starting to sort of go sideways, which is a bit of a worry. Now, normally central banks would go, oh, well, we can afford to take the pedal, the foot off the brake because, we're getting there. But they're terrified that they might actually get it wrong and they bounce up again. So they're going to keep the pressure on a bit more than people think. And as you can see, as I talked about earlier, look at China. China's actually got inflation, below 0. So China hasn't got an inflation problem. China's got a growth problem. And you've got to remember in those New Zealand numbers, none of the announced council rate increases across the country, which, probably average out in the 15s or 16s, I suppose. None of those are in the CPI numbers. They'll start coming in from 1 July when the new rates are set. So that's going to be a bit of a short-term impost on non-tradable inflation as well. So that's the reason why, central banks are still a bit cautious. Now, let's sort of tie that back to where's Waipa? Well, here currently you've got just over $300 million worth of debt, and some of that is just a liquidity requirement. So, it's not really. And as you can see, we've got pretty decent levels of hedging. So, interest rate expense is not going to blow out. It's at the current rated average all up cost of your debt is maybe around 5%, a fraction lower, and there's enough maturities and enough new debt that will fall. How far? Well, how long's a piece of string? But we expect that to drift lower over time because you're well positioned to fill in gaps when interest rates fall. So that's the current profile. Now, if you look at the implied June next year, I think currently debt's implied to be just over 400 million. So this picture just goes forward a year and says everything we've borrowed between now and June next year is overnight on a floating rate basis. So that's not what's going to happen, right? So, but as you can see, the council's going to have to do some fixed rate debt to keep within policy, but it's not massive amount. So, you're going to have to do some borrowings of 5 on the front. But our anticipation is what we'll be looking to do is term out some of this new debt as interest rates start to fall. That's going to be a late this year, early next year story. So we're not going to get too much interest rate relief for 24, 25, but those outline years, we would expect to be able to drive your interest rate expense down closer to that sort of long-term 4 average I was talking about. But the good news is probably that your interest rate expense is not going to probably go too much above 5. You've sort of seen the worst, hopefully. And so tying that all together, what are we thinking about when we talk to the guys around, managing your interest rate risk? Well, we're confident rates will fall, but we're not very confident about the quantum and the timing. We see the neutral cash rate around 3%-ish. So that's the neutral cash rate is one that's neither stimulatory or isn't contracting the economy. So that's probably gone up a little bit from the theoretical 2 levels. Now, this is just you can't observe the neutral cash rate. It's something that central banks project, but it's a model driven thing. It's got lots of factors. So, but if the neutral cash rate is around about 3% and our inflation target's sort of 2-ish on average, that means medium term rates, 4-ish are probably okay. So what I'm saying is that we're going to be doing borrowings with 4s on the front. That's just the way it is, because that's the normal interest rate cycle. And to have some certainty, you've got to have some fixed rate debt. And unfortunately, you're not, while we've got stuff on the book at, 1s and 2s, which is great, it doesn't last forever. And your debt's increasing dramatically compared to where it was 3 years ago. So, but the good thing is we expect rates to be drifting lower. The other thing we need to think about is, we have to have some flexibility too, because we can lock up all your projected debt and say, oh, well, let's just have some certainty. But, well, how certain are we about what debt levels are going to be in the future? We haven't done an LTP cycle. We've done a truncated cycle. So we need some flexibility, because we all know the council funding model is broken. Central government sort of acknowledged that. Everybody knows that, but what is the solution going to be? Three Waters sort of got a whole lot of excitement in council land around debt going off the balance sheet and doing other things. But what's the actual solution going to be? How much debt will disappear? How will it be structured? CCOs, will there be separate borrowing? All this kind of stuff's going to be resolved over time. But that means we need to be flexible about what we're doing. So at the moment, we're really focusing on every loan renewal, every increase in debt. We get together, the team talks, we think about, what's going on, how long we should borrow for, balance that sort of ability to take advantage of lower rates when they happen with giving some certainty and all those kind of things and keeping inside policy. So we've got it, we're really, in some ways, we're micromanaging at the moment because that's what we have to do, because we really want to keep a level of flexibility because the world is, and the outlook for council debt books is still a very uncertain place. And it's really hard for you guys, and that's why, the number of councils that have done interim debt projections rather than the full LTP process, because in actual fact, it's a nonsense. I'm trying to do a 10-year plan when there's so much uncertainty. It just reflects the uncertainty out there. So, I'll try and finish on a positive note. Look, things are probably, we're getting to the worst. The economy, there's some probably more pain to come yet. Everybody's saying survive till 25. Hopefully that's a reasonable sort of view. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that if non-tradable inflation doesn't start to fall a bit quicker than what it has been, the Reserve Bank could actually force us into a much more severe recession, and then it will be forced to do something. So if that happens, they'll just have to cut a lot quicker. And cutting cycles are a lot more aggressive than tightening cycles. So we're comfortable interest rates are going to fall over the next few years. But the next 12 months is not looking great for your constituents, not looking great for their household budgets, and it's not looking great for, businesses in the area as well. The farming sector's doing okay, and the payout will be higher next year. We're expecting Fonterra to announce an $8.40 payout interim midpoint for the 24-25 season. I don't think they'll get up to $8 for this season, but that's okay. But it's certainly not champagne cork time for the dairy sector and the other parts of the export sector. So, it's a bit of a batten down the hatches and, try and save as much money as you can and be sensible because, things are a bit tough.
Earl, I can tell you that Fonterra announced $8 this morning. which was somewhat disappointing to what you said.
Oh, for 24, 25.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I didn't pick up on that. Sorry, I've been tied up.
It's
that
a
is
massive,
disappointing.
massive
because-
band, but with an $8 midpoint.
Yeah, no, we were expecting them to be a little bit more aggressive than that, and yeah, that's I suspect it's the under promise and over deliver. But I would have thought with the trying to get farmers on board around sort of getting rid of their that the retail side of the business, they would have wanted to have a nice number. But yeah, that's interesting. That's a bit disappointing actually. Our models tell us that it should be a bit higher than that. And so that means this year's payout's going to be with a 780, 790, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, they just confirmed. Yeah. This year.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a bit of sad news, but hopefully they're underperforming and they're being conservative and they'll do a bit better.
Okay, any questions, anyone? Oh, Lou, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I was very, very interested in what you actually had say there. What do you think would be the impact of rates, and particularly with the projection a lot of us are actually paying double figure projected for future rates, and what will they do to the inflation rate, as you say, the non-tradable inflation rate?
Rate increases of 16% average around the country are probably going to put about 30 or 40 pips on non-tradable inflation. So let's say, rather than get down to 3, it might be sitting at 3.5 to 4. So it'll slow down the fall because insurance premiums should stabilize over the next 12 months. So that's been a huge impact on inflation, right? You've had 30, 40, 50% increases in insurance costs. Now, if they go to 0, then you suddenly have that, going to 0. So rate increases are an important thing, but don't be, council rate increases aren't the whole driver of this by any stretch of the imagination, but they're certainly not helpful. Now, the other side of the coin, I suppose, is that how far are we away from an election? It's next year, isn't it? Local body elections. So there's going to be a whole lot of people standing for council, I suspect, whose platform's going to be 0 rate increases. The buggers that are there currently are stuffing it up. We're going to not put rates up. Well, as we all know, that they can say that, but they're not going to do it, are they? So that's the implication. You get these short-term, reactions which might make the problem a bit better, but that's the issue we face. This is that. You get these knee-jerk reactions from voters, for example, which makes things worse, and it doesn't actually fix it, does it? So there's a whole lot of implications down the track for rate increases, rather more than just the impact on non-tradable inflation, I think.
Oh, Earl, Gary Diet here. So budget day tomorrow, and an expectation of tax reductions and those sorts of things, pushing more money into the economy. Do you anticipate any sort of change to your predictions as a result of some of these budget announcements tomorrow?
Well, I'm hoping they're fully I'm hoping rather than smoke and mirrors, they actually have they have paid for the tax cuts by savings and and other adjustments to spending and taxes other places, because if they deliver a whole lot of tax cuts and they've already delivered significant tax cuts to landlords, for example, over the next 4 years, so that's in the numbers. If they actually delivered a whole lot of unfunded in real terms tax cuts, the Reserve Bank would probably look on that a bit negatively. I hope and I think they won't, but with any budget there's going to be a few smoke and mirrors and a few pushing things out. They could surprise us, and be almost like a cross between Ruth Richardson and Douglas back in the day, when we really had bad budgets when things were in trouble. But the reality is New Zealand is in trouble, so we probably need something. We need something a bit aggressive. But yeah, hopefully the budget is not going to have too much of an impact. But I am just a little bit worried that they've tried to fudge the numbers, because the Reserve Bank is not going to be happy about that. And they signalled it when they met last week that they don't know what's in the budget. But if it's more stomach than what they're thinking, they're going to have to react to that because that's non-tradable going up as well.
Okay, Roger.
Yeah, thank you. Roger Gordon, Earl. That was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask, so you've answered that one. But the other concern I've got is that China is our biggest trading partner, and yet I heard from another voice last week that the actual projection of the China population is that it's going to reduce to 50% of its current population level by the end of the century.
Yeah, that's
Now,
about right.
that's going to be a progressive reduction on demand from China. How's that going to impact the future projection of our tradables with China and the impact that it's going to have on our economy?
We'll need to find other markets, won't we? In Southeast Asia, there are countries in Southeast Asia growing, but in general terms, the global population is projected to be the peak is much lower than what people thought, and it's not unreasonable to expect that China's population will be down 30, 40, 50% by the turn of the century. Now, we've got a live example of this. Japan's current population is 120 million. By 2030, 2040, that'll be down to about 90 million. So a quarter of your population disappears. You know, that's pretty good for wait times in hospitals and stuff. But if your population's all old, who's going to be looking after you anyway? Now, China is an issue. I mean, last year, China's population declined for the first time since, you know, the Cultural Revolution, you know, when they were slaughtering people. So you look at companies like A2 and, you know, like the demand for baby formulas for them because births are down about 3 or 4 million a year. While they're given incentives for them to have more children, people can't afford to have children. Globally, the main problem with population is that people can't afford to have children. You know, people having 1 or 2 children because they're expensive to run, and you know they haven't got the wherewithal to do it. Because globally, wealth is being focused more and more on an increasingly small percentage of people. So most of the wealth is with a small number of people. Now, with the best breeding ability in the world at that end of the economy, and they probably don't do it, you ain't gonna make up for the people at the other end who can't afford to have it. So structurally, it's an issue, you know. And New Zealand as an exporter to China has got some medium-term issues. You know, we can't just kid ourselves and say that the Chinese are going to continue to buy more and more of our stuff. China now produces nearly 80% of its own milk, up from 55%. So, you know, we sell a lot more in the Middle East and other places, but it's certainly a challenge for us, you know, and New Zealand's productivity has been woeful for 30 years. You know, our percentage of exports is the same as it was 20, 30 years ago, 30 odd percent. Ireland's now 100%. As an export-led economy, when you haven't increased your exports as a percentage of your GDP, what's happening? And I can tell you what's happened. 75% of all debt lending's gone to us buying more expensive houses off each other. No capital gains in that area. You know, structurally, there's some big issues for New Zealand to face.
Philip.
Yeah. Hi, Al. Philip Coles. Just carrying on from what Roger Gordon just mentioned. The population in India is growing, though, isn't it? Dramatically, and their economy as well. And it's fascinating watching their election at the moment. More fascinating watching theirs than the American one. But yeah, but is that helping a lot with India, with their population and the economy growing too?
Well, India will hopefully help, but doing business in India is tortuous. Protecting your IP and stuff is very difficult compared to China. China's a cakewalk compared to India. India is a very difficult market. It's a very diverse market. The reason why we were so successful in exporting to China and we've had huge growth is that China's a command economy. You know, the government says X happens and X happens. In India, there's huge levels of bureaucracy. There's huge different areas. There's a whole, you know, there's countries within countries. So India's potentially a market that could pick up a lot of our slack. That's absolutely right. But it's not going to be an easy task. But that's the kind of thing we have to be doing.
All right, I think that brings us to a conclusion. There's no more questions here, Earl. So I don't know whether to thank you or not. That was a little bit depressing.
Well, hopefully Brad will be more upbeat?
I don't
I'd have
know.
thought- Okay,
Can we
well,
do another enhanced annual plan instead of a 10-year?
yeah, I think so. Well, I
Probably
mean, as I said, everybody knows deep down the funding model for local government's broken, right? There's been so many extra charges imposed on local government from central government over the last 10 to 15 years. And the chickens are coming home to roost, aren't they? So there needs to be, central government needs to actually step back, and we need a new system. You guys need different levers to fund because the old model can't work.
Thanks, Earl. Yeah. Probably Brad will be more optimistic, but I've got a feeling you'll be more accurate. So thanks for that.
Okay, a pleasure always. And as I said, every time some money's borrowed by the council, and we're micromanaging because things are so uncertain. But hopefully we'll get through this, and it'll be a good result in the medium term.
Good on you. Thanks, Earl. Appreciate your time here.
Have a good day, everybody. Lovely talking to you. Bye.
Well, it's always lunch.
And that is lunchtime, yeah. And we got Brad at 12:45, I believe. Sorry, Melissa, do you want to say something?
Lunch is now bread and dripping.
Well, yours might be.
We're just breaking for lunch, okay? 12:45 back here for Brad. Streaming this, right? Good to go? All right. Welcome, Brad. Always good to see you. We've been suitably depressed by Earl prior to lunch, so I'm just going to hand over to you to make us feel good for the afternoon, okay?
Oh, right. Thank you. I was going to say at this point I should just have a lapel mic that's like permanently there, and I just put it into a different splitter box every time. Good afternoon, everyone. It is lovely to be back. I always wish that I have good news. I feel like I probably don't at this point, although the difference at the moment does feel like a little bit of a, I know that Nicola Wilson said this a lot, so I don't want to parrot her too much, but the darkest before the dawn sort of piece is perhaps viable. A lot of the trends we are seeing out there in the economy are quite hard at the moment. They're hitting a lot harder, probably even in the last few months. We're definitely getting more reports of that. But also a feeling that go through sort of in 12 months' time or so, the idea of survive till 2025 is a real thing. That's when the green shoots start to emerge a little bit more. So as usual, I'll sort of take the next sort of half an hour-ish to go through some of the trends that we're seeing out there in the economy, both the important national, global sort of stuff and how Waipa's going. In some places, very, very similar to the national trend. In other areas, perhaps bucking them, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But we'll go through that more so that you've got that understanding and context. And then, like I say, more than happy to take questions afterwards. First things first, on inflation, we're still seeing an improvement coming through there. We've got inflation for households down to 4%, was at 7.3. So, you know, quite a lot of runs on the board coming through. The issue is that 4% is still double what we want it to be. So we're a way away from getting inflation fully under control. It's too high, it's taking too long. And the reason I guess that's a risk, because you hear a lot of people say, well, you know, is it actually that bad? 4 is better than 7.5, 7.3. Well, not better to just leave it there. It does create over time those sort of pressures where households start to build in an expectation of 4%, and that changes the dynamics of how much they spend, how they invest, and so on and so forth. The worry and the risk at the moment is that the pressures on the economy and on pricing are still coming from us. The way that inflation has been brought down so far is because of international dynamics, which is great, but we didn't do anything to contribute to that. You can see on the slides tradables inflation, so internationally focused pricing trends. They've come back quite a bit. The rest of the world, like us, have put up interest rates. We've been seeing those pressures come back. You've seen fuel prices, for example, not back at the levels that they were after the likes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So fantastic. We didn't do anything about it. It means that we're very exposed if anything else were to happen. If you were to see further changes in the Middle East, for example, that threatened oil supplies, then you'd see that number jump back up, and we'd also have no ability to influence it. Our worry is the orange line there for non-tradable domestically based inflation, still sticking at a stubbornly high level. It's only moderated back to about 5.8%. You can see there back in history that it's been hovering around, if not just slightly above 2%. So it's at least double, closer almost to triple what you'd want it to be. Looking through some of those domestically based pressures, some of them are places that are not going to be influenced much by interest rates. They're people's dwelling rents, you know, they're paying for the roof over their head. You could jack up interest rates as much as you want. People still need to put a roof over their heads. Insurance costs big and up quite substantially as well at the moment. And of course, a fairly vital piece there. Local government rates, another one where people have to pay them. They contribute a huge number of services, but they're sort of hitting as well. And so there is a bit of a feeling where if you've got a few thorny, sticky parts of core inflation that are still too high and are unlikely to move particularly quickly, you then question, to get that average number back to where you want it to be, do you have to hit all the other stuff almost more than you otherwise would have to bring the average under control? What's interesting as well is sort of, in a sense, 4% from a headline inflation figure sounds all not too bad. It's just that some of the cumulative increases we've seen over the last couple of years means that even though it's a smaller increase this year, it's a smaller one on a bigger one the year before, on a bigger one the year before that. To profile that, of the 140 or so, I think, classes that Stats NZ looks at for households, here are the top 20 with the change since or over the last 4 years. Some of them you can sort of move through, the likes of international air travel up about 60% over the last couple of years at the bottom. But the other sort of trends through that you'll note is that just about every insurance type is up there. You've got contents, you've got vehicle, you've got dwelling, so on and so forth. Again, some of those essentials, other essentials like pets, still costing quite a bit more. Fruit and vegetables in terms of food, rubbish and recycling coming through as well. So there's quite a variety of options up there. What is probably most interesting is that a lot, not all, but a lot of those are also services more than just physical goods, or at least there's a bit of a mix. And that's one of the reasons that the Reserve Bank, and in fact ourselves, look a lot at the labour market, because some of that services-based inflation is based on how much you have to pay the person to provide those services as well. So a bit of a mix coming through there. Now, we've also done some analysis recently for local government New Zealand that's been talked about across the country, and that's explaining why rates increases are so high, because I think everyone knows that they're high, the community certainly know that. But as with consumer price inflation, we often only talk about the end number, not how we got there. And so LGNZ has asked us to go through and examine some of those costs, and we have done. We found the likes of, bridges have increased in cost 38% over the last couple of years. Other things sort of 27%, 30%, for roads and water systems and what have you. So all of those are actually above the headline rate of inflation. Now, with the fact that it's more expensive to deliver infrastructure, plus the fact that you need to deliver more infrastructure for a growing population, plus the fact you need to then repair and recover the infrastructure you previously had, means that you're paying a lot on top of a lot on top of a lot. But this is probably the first time we've properly done some analysis on some of those actual cost pressures on local government. And certainly from the economist point of view, where a lot of the time I can't say that I've done a lot in a day's work. It's very, very hard, right, for us to prove anything. I think this has actually started a bit more of a reasonable conversation around why local government costs are increasing and what that means through to people, and why if you want a bridge, then you're paying quite a bit more for it. Same steel, same asphalt and what have you that's come through, same people, but all costing a lot more. Now, to be fair, we expected, or everyone expected, a bit of inflation. We sort of always do. It's just that when the last set of LTPs were put together, the expectation around inflation was quite different. We hadn't lived through the high inflation that has come through in recent years. To demonstrate that, this is the difference between what you might have originally expected inflation costs to do, civil construction costs to do in the blue line, since sort of based at the end of 2020, and what the orange line is what actually happened. Now, two important trends there. One, there's a massive gap that's come through. So that, I think, just highlights how out of kilter some of these things have gotten. The other one to note, though, is that orange line has started to plateau out a bit more through 2023. So it's encouraging to see that although you've seen those costs go up substantially, you're not seeing them sort of continue to rise by huge, huge amounts each and every quarter. So we are starting to get things a bit more under control. But again, up 21% on what you would have expected the prior trend to be means that, long story short, as I remember discussing with council, I'm sure last year, if you had, say, 5 projects worth 20 million each last time round, you now need to effectively cut one of those to pay for the cost escalation on the other 4. And that's, I think, difficult, particularly for households to consider, when previously it was, well, I pay more and I get more. And that's generally how things have worked. It's now you pay more to get the same, if not maybe slightly less. And so that trade-off conversation becomes so much more important. The other one, just because it is budget day tomorrow, is that as much as everyone focuses on what their rates bill is, often it pales in comparison to what they contribute through to government. So as part of that analysis that we did for LGNZ, we did do a few numbers just looking at, on a broad basis, what would it look like in terms of average rates paid versus what a household, a similar sort of household, might pay in tax. And so you can see here about 2.8k on average was what last year the average rates for a household was, residential rates across the country. An average tax paid, if you assume people on the median wage and you assume how much they spend as a household in terms of GST, you're talking 37k. And which one do we focus a lot more on? Well, we focus on the very small bar. We have huge hearings about it and have to make all those difficult decisions. And then tomorrow politicians will make some decisions about where the 37k each goes, and we'll just have to like it or lump it, sort of thing. So I think it is just important to recognise that, given that local government brings in about 10% of total collected funds across the country, and that's both rates and fees and charges and what have you, 10% brought in, responsible for about 25% of the infrastructure. So again, that imbalance is very clear. We did do some analysis around how much, if you provided the GST on rates back to councils, how much that would contribute. I'm not going to lie, when I did the press stand-up on the forecourt at Parliament with the LGNZ president, we didn't think that the government would be particularly keen, and funnily enough, they weren't. But I think it is part of that conversation of just continually highlighting these sort of pressures, because I don't think that local government fully central government fully understands that local government challenge. I certainly don't think households get it either. So look, I'll stop beating on about my own work, but I did think that was quite interesting analysis to bring to the table, and certainly all of you will know it around the table, but I think it's useful for that conversation out there with households and businesses around that. Can we do questions at the end? I'll come back to the slide though at the time so that we can question on it. The wider hit, I guess, that we're seeing coming through to the economy, we are expecting now to last for longer. The Reserve Bank came out last week with an expectation or a comment that they were thinking perhaps of raising interest rates again. We found that quite chilling on the economy. We don't actually think they'll do it. I think they've lost their own messaging a bit in the noise. But long story short, even if they don't raise interest rates, the fact that they're talking about it in those terms suggests that they're certainly not looking to cut them anytime soon. So it will take a while in our minds for that hit to come through. That's important because it does then mean that we have to look a little bit closer at some of the dynamics in the local economy. Now, I've shown you this chart for those of you who have been around the council table for a while, a few times. There is a difference this time round. Every other time I've come to you and I've shown you our latest detailed data from our regional economic profile, agriculture, forestry and fishing has been the largest employer in the district. It flipped last year to construction, ever so slightly, but it did flip. And I think that's just worthwhile to note. We have seen that trend across the country where there's been a lot more construction activity and therefore there's been a lot more construction employment that's come through. That's not just a Waipa thing, that's an everyone thing. But you now do have your two biggest employing industries sort of more away from the national average than otherwise. And so it does just create, exposure might be the wrong word, but it sort of creates a little bit more focus on where your economic drivers are. I'll show you some of the construction figures in a sec, so I'll get back to that, but sort of wanted to give you that sort of structural piece to start with. One of the other challenges, and particularly then looking at the still large part of your industry that's in the likes of the primary sector, is global economic situation at the moment. Still fairly capped. You can see the green line there for growth next year, expected to be around about 2.5%. Current expectations for growth this year, also around that 2.5% mark. That's not awful, but it is slower than we would have expected coming out the other side of the pandemic, just because everyone else across the world has done the same as us. They've had high inflation in most of the developed world. They've raised interest rates. They're spending more on their mortgages. They're not spending as much on other goods, and that means that our exports are also not commanding quite the attention that they might have been before. So a feeling that we are a little bit more worried about that global economic environment, particularly with our largest trading partner, China, seeing 2 years now of population decline. First time that's happened since the Great Famine of the 60s. The challenge or the concern there is that New Zealand had been and is still trading a lot to China. It's just that the idea previously was they had a growing population, they were urbanising, there were lots of young people who were getting involved in buying New Zealand products. Now you've got the population falling, you've got youth unemployment that's been increasing. There's still good opportunities in China. I went there myself last year to get a bit of a boots on the ground look, and there's still opportunity. It's just that we're going to have to work for it a lot more. And it also suggests that the work that the government's doing around free trade agreements with India and the UAE are important, because we've got to continue to find as many different friends in the trading space as possible. And that's all because we are seeing those export prices be a bit more subdued. So I've inflation adjusted these just because what we are sort of hearing and seeing, certainly from the primary sector, is that sometimes the revenue numbers look all right. It's just that because the costs have increased as well, the actual profitability piece has been hit, and that's affecting the amount of spending going out in the economy too. So you can see here the likes of Hort, still the best performer. Dairy, not bad, all things considered, and the likes of meats and forestry certainly in a lower position. Now, to be fair, indexes I always find a little bit hard to go through. They're useful to show you a trend, but they're not so useful when you go, what does 100 mean? So let's give you some detail. We expect that for Waipa at the moment, around a $581 million payout from dairy alone this season, about 24 million down on last season, but Fonterra confirmed this morning that they've raised their pick for the season ahead. up to $8, which is encouraging. So that feeling at the moment when we've looked through the data that the average farm, and this is very much the average, is just above break even in terms of the payout that they'll be getting, but then next season looks a little bit better ahead. So again, restraint, but a feeling of something better as we go forward. On the meat prices, though, that's where the challenge comes through. Lamb prices now down at a 7-year low and continuing to remain relatively soft. Again, that's a demand and supply story. Demand offshore is not as strong as we might have liked it. That's true for a number of products. It's just that because there were dry conditions in Australia last year, they've killed a whole bunch of lambs and sheep and they've flooded the market with supply. And pretty clearly what happens there is what happened in New Zealand shops over Christmas, that you could find some lamb for pretty cheap because they needed to get rid of it. And to get rid of it, you've got to do it cheap because no one will buy it when it's expensive. So that sort of trend's been emerging as well. Similar, but not nearly as bad for the likes of beef. But altogether, the fact that you've got prices that are a bit lower at the moment, still just hitting in terms of that revenue piece for farmers. Here's the good news. Prices in the last 6 months have been flat in the primary sector after going up quite a bit, and you can see that build up through 2021, 22, 23. The last 6 months there's been no effective change in on-farm costs, which is a shift. We're not there, things haven't gotten a whole bunch cheaper, but it's just a little bit of a sign of encouragement that if we can try and hold those costs where they are and at the same time revenues continue to recover, particularly into next year, that gives you a little bit more economic runway. Just briefly onto the spending. So we've talked about that, the primary sector part of the economy. Back to the households for a second. I guess long story short, we're seeing that pullback pretty sharply coming through across the country. Don't focus too much on any one region here. If you want, this is just the 16 regions. The Waikato region is fourth on my chart here. It's more to demonstrate that if you look at spending growth in December 2022 compared to a year earlier, the blue bars, massive, quite big, real big pullback across the board coming through. Households very much being hit in the pockets and seeing that decline emerge. You will note as well that Wellington is the worst performer on that, which I think speaks to the fact that you do still have this sort of piece. You can see Auckland's not all that great either. You've still got that piece around the likes of people who are working from home. You've got general pullbacks in the urban centres because of that. And then in Wellington, you've got the public sector cutbacks that are starting to hit as well. More locally, things are actually not too bad. Now, this data is up until March 2024, so 2 months old, if you will, at this point. Showing a 6.8% increase. Interestingly, that's both a 6.8% increase for the quarter and for the year. Now, why is that important? Because most of the parts of the country that I'm going to at the moment, they still have a strong annual growth rate. There was still a lot of money spent for 9 months or so ago. It's just that the most recent number has slowed back quite significantly. Here, you still seem to have a bit of momentum. However, and this is only anecdotal, but anecdotally we do hear, and we have been hearing quite consistently across the country, that the first couple of months of 2024 felt all right for people. Not awesome, but people were sort of going, oh, it's not that bad. And then it seems to have hit a lot more. We've had some business meetings recently across the country where people have said, look, last 2 months, sales have really hit a bit harder. That sort of push and pressure coming through from households has been biting. And I think that part of that is that up until sort of the first couple of months of this year, you had interest rates dragging activity down and migration pushing things up. And up until that point, you had probably migration a little bit counterbalancing or overbearing on the interest rate bit. Now that you're starting to see net migration pull back a touch, you've now got the interest rate hit that's becoming a little bit more visible out there in the economy. Just briefly as well, because I know that it's one of those things where we always get asked about some of the data and that we bring in. One of the things we have done, and this is for Waipa as well, given that you get our quarterly monitor, we have expanded some of that in recent times. So we've added a whole second level of detail around the likes of the labour market, housing activity, social activity and similar. So as we go forward, I will be trying to include some more of those trends to discuss it, because I know that people are asking more of those questions. So just noting that if you're ever using it online. And we've also brought forward in our regional analysis some figures now around Pacific population, because that was an area or a group that we never had a lot of understanding on, and a bit more of a data function as well. So like I say, not a hard sell, just highlighting some of the changes that we have been bringing through on that front. All right, let's talk housing because this one really is fascinating. Now, of course, everyone's interested probably because of their own house, but also because there is a wealth effect in the economy that the more expensive someone's house is, the more they think they are rich and the more that they might spend. Even if that's not true in terms of cash money, they feel richer and they do spend. It is a real effect and it's come through in New Zealand quite a bit. Interestingly, at the moment, given those pressures on interest rates, from interest rates and similar, the proportion of the mortgage book that is non-performing and not paying their mortgage loans has been increasing. But you'll see here that it's sort of less than 1% of the entire mortgage book. And I think that just goes to show that where there are real pressures, it's on quite a small concentrated group. That's not to say that other people are more than happily paying their mortgage. It's just that when people look at these figures, I sometimes think they expect them to be absolutely huge. They're not, and they're not even close to GFC levels yet, but they are on the rise and that pressure is definitely coming forward. We see that in a number of areas around vulnerable households, particularly the likes of KiwiSaver withdrawals across the country for hardship. That's rising, and I know as a JP that's a very difficult process to go through, and so the fact that people are going through that process and taking more money out does suggest that they are under more and more pressure. At the same time, you've seen that the number of houses available for sale has been creeping up. Now, we don't have Waipa specific figures for stock of houses available for sale, which is why I've showed you the Waikato figures. We do have listings which are showing a similar trend for Waipa, but this was sort of a slightly more convincing one. It wasn't as many squiggly lines. What you'll see here, though, is that general view that you've got now some of the highest numbers of properties listed on and available on the property market since about 2015 or so. Now, it's not a great time to sell a house because house prices are broadly tracking sideways. And so what these figures imply is that there are more and more households across the country and here locally that are going, look, I'm not yet foreclosing on my mortgage. I can still make the repayments, but I'm very uncomfortable with it. It's a much greater struggle. And now I'm having to think, instead of being pushed by the bank, am I better to try and do it myself? Maybe I try and downsize, I test the market a bit more. So you are seeing a lot more sellers out there on the market trying to sell their house. At the same time, house price growth is fairly muted. For Waipa, it's up 4.2% over the last year. You'll see on the line, though, that it's fairly flat on the last wee while. It's still quite a way below the peak. Hasn't been as affected here as the national sort of ups and downs, but we're expecting as well that on the national basis at least, house prices might not get back to that 2021 peak until perhaps 2029. And a lot of that is just because at the moment, sure, you've got a lot of people selling, but there's very, very few buyers out there. And I sort of, highlighted in terms of at the moment, not that many people could go in and get a mortgage because they're going in, they've got a certain amount of income, the bank just won't lend at that level. And so what increasingly happens is you've got a much smaller pool of buyers, you've got a much bigger pool of sellers. I'll walk around to the house on the street and go, look, I'm the only seller you're probably going to see today. Either make your house the one that I buy by making it a bit cheaper, or there are 5 others on the same street that will do me a better deal. So, who's going to sort of blink first? And there's no other buyers coming through. So with so much supply competition, with so many sellers on the market, we do expect those house prices to remain subdued into the future. That's making it less upbeat for the construction market. And you can see here that the number of consents for Waipa down about 57% over the last year. You're now back to sort of levels last seen around sort of 2013 or so. So that is quite a steep pullback. It's much sharper than the sort of 25% national drop. Part of that, I think, is the fact that you did have, such a big build-up in more recent times and some of the population growth that you've seen coming through. Plus the fact that, for developers who are thinking of putting in work, they've had infrastructure costs themselves that have increased. They're not getting as much if they build the house and then sell it, and their own financing is more difficult. So this is a trend we're seeing across the country. Like I say, it's perhaps more important in recent times given that construction has become the largest employer in the area. You've seen a pullback as well in the likes of non-residential consent activity, down about 63%. So we are talking some big falls. These are probably the most difficult numbers I've shown in a long time to this council, because normally, you have been seeing some pretty strong growth. I do think that's important to recognise, though, that you have seen that strong growth and now we're into a slightly softer period. If you were seeing these sort of drops after not having had any growth coming up, you'd be going, this is really challenging. Whereas you do look at it at the moment as a bit more, hopefully as a blip, until that sort of interest rate push or pressure starts to come off, then there'll be a bit more investment that starts to come through. But for a lot of people in the construction sector, they'd probably tell you, and I expect many of them have, that they might have work at the moment, but they probably don't have another job lined up immediately. And so there will be a bit more pressure. Depending on who you are, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you've got that pressure or that slack in the construction sector starting to come through, that's where builders are going to have to start competing on price a bit more. And so there is those competitive pressures that come back, and that's sort of encouraging. We're hearing, from example, from people who are doing more home renovations than before, because you go back a year and a half, no one was free to do a reno. Now they are free, and now you actually have the capacity. So we are seeing some shifts there as well. Okay, to the government. Tomorrow is budget day. It's my Christmas, Easter, New Year's, birthday and everything else rolled into one. I'll be locked up for a couple of hours with the documents and I will absolutely love it. I won't make too many predictions today, only because I feel like economists do this all the time. None of us actually know. If you're watching the TV tomorrow before 2 p.m, someone will be on a panel somewhere opining about what they think is going to happen. And honestly, who actually knows? We sort of have to wait. But there are a few clues as to the challenges that they'll face as well. First thing is that the corporate tax take is down 12% year on year. And that's, of course, businesses not making as much profit and therefore not paying quite as much tax. The difficulty is that has dragged back total Crown earnings down to only grow about 3% over the last year. 3% growth comes at the same time as the population's expanded by nearly 3% itself, and inflation's up 4%. So very simple mathematics says you need nearly 7% growth in the tax take just to do the exact same for the same number of people into the next year. And they haven't got that. So there is going to be a downgrade in the revenue track, and that means that just like any household or business or council, that you have to sort of trim your costs a bit to meet the sort of revenue numbers that you've got in as well. We are expecting to see that come through, but you'll see that even on the forecasts out last year from the government was that it would take until perhaps 2027 for them to even get close to the long-term average in terms of their spending as a proportion of the economy. So we are expecting a lot more fiscal restraint to come forward. We're not expecting any of the tax cuts and similar to be particularly inflationary to the economy, because it's just a switcheroo between government spending it and household spending it. But I think the worry in a sense is that the government still has been spending a lot. They will want to manage that down over time. They won't want to do it too quickly, because some of the evidence there is that if you do try to really cut and go austerity hardcore, it can actually sort of damage confidence in the economy. So there's a bit of a managing those expectations down over time. All of that means that we're expecting economic activity to be fairly flat and lower over the next year. We've downgraded most of those expectations. These were our April forecasts. To be fair, I'd expect that we would either drag down or push out when we're next to our forecast, given that sort of trend in the economy that we're getting there, but we're getting there slower than expected. And that means that for businesses as well, business investment's already negative, and we expect it to continue to be so. And that's partly because at the start of this year, we were thinking, look, businesses might need to hunker down for a couple of months and then something better emerges and then they can start to rev the economic engine up. The longer they leave it, the more that people sit on their hands and the less investment that continues to go through. So again, that feeling of just everything is going to take a bit longer. But as I was saying to some people in the break before, the surprising thing is, despite all of this bad news that I've given you, more businesses on net reckon that they are optimistic about next year than pessimistic, which sounds very, very unusual given what I've just told you. But I think it is genuinely that feeling of now is tough. Brighter lights are coming through next year. We're sort of getting through the train tunnel. It's proper light, it's genuine light. It's not just another train coming through, but the tunnel is longer than first expected. And so if you can hold out, survive till 2025 is still viable. Briefly then on to migration and employment before I lastly turn to interest rates. This is probably still a more broader worry, not only now but into the future. We've had some very high inflows into the country, which has been supporting the labour market in some areas. You can see that it's jumping around quite a bit, but it's generally trending down that blue dashed line. The worry for me is the likes of the dark blue line towards the bottom, the solid one of New Zealand departures, which has made it now to its highest ever level. In fact, we've had 52,000 more New Zealanders leave the country than come back in over the last 12 months, a record loss. And it is that feeling where we're losing our particularly young talent. We don't have as much ability in my mind to attract them back. And that also means that really, although at the moment, yes, we'll see higher unemployment and what have you, but if you think back sort of 2 years ago when we were struggling to find talent, that's sort of a bit of a portal perhaps still into the future when we are going to have census data out today showing we've got an older population. That means that over time we're going to have more and more people that retire, fewer and fewer young people, that are entering life because birth rates are going down, more and more young people who are leaving overseas that we're not attracting back, does sort of put a bit of a squeeze on our workforce in about 30 years' time or so. That's important here locally as well. If you look at the figures for Waipa, the big one at the moment is not necessarily driven by international migration, it's more by that internal migration. It's been very strong in recent times and very stable, and that sort of speaks to the fact you've had working from home trends and what have you emerge. But if you look at that orange line for the natural increase, you can see that it's now fallen to its lowest level in a while. It's still positive, and so the natural increase is number of births locally minus the number of deaths, but at some point in the next sort of 20 years or so, we'll have to change the name from natural increase to natural change because it will actually turn into natural decline. As you have that older population who move into their older demographic and do eventually pass away, and not as many young people coming forward. The birth rate across the country is, I think, edged down to something like 1.6 births coming through for every woman, which is below the 2.1 replacement rate. So we are moving into a difficult or a more difficult demographic situation. More in the moment is the fact that we've had those job ads continuing to trend down. You'll see here job ads down about 11% below pre-pandemic levels. What's interesting is that, again, that's a national figure, and so it's not quite as bad here locally. If we look at some of the SEEK job ads across the country, the likes of the West Coast and Wellington have had some of the biggest drops from a year earlier. You can see the Waikato, we don't get territorial authority data, but the Waikato is the fourth highest, still down about 20-ish%, but sort of in a much better position than other areas. So definitely a pullback, but perhaps a little bit more resilience on the jobs front locally. That's confirmed by the number of filled jobs that we're seeing in the economy, up 1.3%. And you can see that it bounces around, and part of that is the quarterly data. But we are, if I showed you the chart for a few other areas over the last year, a lot of them have basically just plateaued and flattened out. So you're still eking out some of that growth. It's just not sort of as strong as it might have previously been. A real mix as well in terms of what's coming forward. So you can see the likes of the primary sector and construction having fallen in the last year, down 50 jobs or sort of 60 jobs or so for construction, down just over 100 for the primary sector. But other boosts in other areas, you look at the likes of health and education, that's what happens when you have that larger population. They need those resources. So there's some natural growth coming forward. Also encouraging to see a little bit more manufacturing activity coming through, and that's likely, from my recollection of the numbers that I looked at this morning, a bit more in the food-based area too. We do expect that unemployment will reach 5% later this year, so that is going to be a challenge that will continue to come through. It does seem like you'll see a slower increase coming through for Waipa, given that you've got those stronger growth figures in jobs at the moment, but still a trend that we're likely to see job seekers starting to creep up as well. Probably the big worry is still that we're, with all of this, the long-term trends are not great around our productivity. We keep saying we want to work smarter, not harder, yet we keep doing the opposite and working harder, not smarter. And so I do sort of worry about that over the long term in terms of, are we investing in the right places? Are we using ChatGPT for the right things and what have you? Because at some point we're going to have not all that many workers coming into the workforce, a lot of them leaving and either using technology or somehow doing triple the jobs that we are at the moment. I know I've banged on about that a lot, so I won't labour the point, but you can see on those lines they're not particularly upbeat, and certainly I think the biggest worry is that our capital productivity, the stuff that should be the thing that is helping us, is actually one of our biggest hindrances. So even when we do invest in the right areas, we seem to pay a lot and not get the best payoff from it. So we've got to be careful with our cash as well. Because of how important some of that is locally on the working from home, I did just want to show you, we've got some updated figures that have come through here. Still a persistent sort of third of the population who are generally working from home across the country, not every day, but fairly persistently. What's interesting is that the green bars here are the proportion of the workforce that we estimate has the opportunity to work from home. Because we didn't measure before COVID-19 how many people did work from home, this gives us a bit of a sort of view over time. Back in 2006, around 23% of the workforce could, we don't know if they did, but could work from home, up to about 29% in 2018. The latest figures out at the end of, start of this year for the end of last year, it showed that 43% of the workforce can now work from home. So it really has enhanced some capabilities in some areas. And I think that really does highlight the push and the focus here around sort of creating your own living environment and the focus that you've got on attracting people into the district. That's been working. You saw that with the internal migration figures, and that sort of focus on creating those plans for the future continue to remain important. Very briefly, then the last bit on the interest rate pieces, we do expect that most of the pain has come through for a lot of households. Around about 85% of households have now refixed onto a higher mortgage rate. Maybe not the absolute end figure, but pretty close to. There's still a little bit to go, but for a lot of households, it's now how long can they cope with that pain? Is it going to be 3 months? Is it going to be a lot longer? And so that feeling that the pressure is still going to be on, and probably importantly, won't necessarily pull back particularly quickly, will be a challenge. We've seen the Reserve Bank be pretty clear in their statement last week that they think they've got a job to do. To be fair to them, they've got one job to do, it's to bring inflation under control, and they've missed the mark on that for the last couple of years. If I was in that position, I kept getting things so wrong. To be fair, as an economist, it sometimes feels like that. But, you know, I can understand why they're pushing pretty hard back against expectations of changing anything because they desperately want to hit their mark. You can see here they keep sort of pushing up and pushing out their expectations of when interest rates start to fall back. So our view at the moment, the Reserve Bank's view is that they think it might be the second half of next year now by the time they actually change the official cash rate. Our view is a little bit more optimistic. We had at the start of this year been thinking more around November this year. We've now pushed it out till the start of next year, but we do think that sort of by February next year, they should have enough information that because they should be forward looking, they don't actually want inflation to get to 2% by the time they change it. They need to act before that. They should be able to gaze into the future and say, look, we're in the right direction, give it another quarter or two and it'll be there, which means that they should now at that point, February 2025 at this point, have a bit of an understanding of that they can push that out. The challenge is that you might not hear them say anything about that particularly quickly. Because financial markets have been so overzealous at thinking that interest rate cuts are coming through, the Reserve Bank will be really wary about sort of racking them up too quickly. This chart, a little bit confusing, but bear with. The red line there is the Reserve Bank's expectation of the official cash rate over time. You can see they're only picking it sort of from maybe May next year when they start to pull it back. The orange line there is our forecast back in April, and we'll be updating that in a couple of months. And then the other lines are where the market pricing was. And you can see back in February this year, markets were on a tear. They were looking forward to heaps of cuts, and they thought they knew far better than everyone else. And they got that quite wrong. And so they've moderated that stance a little bit more. But you can see that they sort of, if you look at it over time, if we did this day by day, they do this thing where they get some new news from the Reserve Bank and they sort of jump up quite sharply and they get closer to where the Reserve Bank's probably thinking. Then over time, they just gradually come back to a much, because everyone just gets a bit more confident. They think they know better. And then it sort of comes back. So you can see that there in terms of the figures up until May had dropped below April because the market thought it knew better. If I put on the figure at the end of last week after the Reserve Bank did come out with its announcement, it shot back up again. So this feeling of there is that interest rate relief coming. It's still a little way off, but it is going to be there. But the minute the Reserve Bank even utters a thought about it, everyone's going to jump on the bandwagon and they'll probably overdo it again. So I could see a scenario where the Reserve Bank says absolutely nothing until the day that they actually cut interest rates because they almost need to surprise the markets so that everyone doesn't react. All right, that is it. So the long story short there is that there are challenging times at the moment. There are still challenging times ahead, but there is some feeling of some green shoots. It's just not quite clear if that's the start of next year or sort of a little bit further into it. but a feeling that households are feeling it, businesses are feeling it, those cost pressures, although they might not be as intense right here, right now, they've built up a lot over time. And so there's still a lot of pressures in the economy that people are working through. How do they fund things? Are the numbers coming in for their business or their household enough to pay for their outgoings? All of that causing a lot of concern, but a feeling that, like I say, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It just takes a little bit longer to get there. With that, through you, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Brad. Andrew, can you remember the slide that you wanted to ask a question
I
about?
can.
Yeah, I can not only remember it, but I'm impatient and I answered my own question in the end.
Oh, good.
But it was, what is the average percentage tax take for that average household? And I worked it out at 28%.
Yeah, I was going to say about 29% would have been my gut reaction. So, yep. It is interesting, like here, because generally we only talk about income tax, right? Here I have tried to add back in the GST bit that's paid as well to give, because that is sort of more of a household bit. I haven't tried to attribute company profits back to households. That's really a little bit beyond this sort of exercise, but it is a useful example there in terms of just how large the figures are. And like I say, I mean, the fact that everyone spends so much time going through what councils spend on, which is appropriate community interaction, don't get me wrong, it's just that for the large amount that central government brings in, we don't do any of that.
Hey, Brad, you're a lot younger than me, but how do you think this COVID inflation spike compares to the oil price spikes of the 70s?
I think this one's possibly been worse and perhaps stickier only because it wasn't just oil, right? But back then, oil then filtered through into other things. It's absolutely true. I think here you had not only the sort of supply shock and the demand shock from COVID, you then overlay that with your own oil shock just from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That sort of in of itself, that would have been enough. But it is that fact that you've got a lot of those other pressures that have come through that do seem to make some of those other things stickier. So the likes of your dwelling rents, the likes of your insurance that's come through, even local government rates, like not all of that is directly because of oil. And so the fact that it's sort of a multi-pronged inflationary beast makes us a little bit worried about, that persistence that's come through on it, and the fact that maybe it won't stick around as long, but like I say, you might have to hit the economy more on the parts that can get hit to try and bring down the average number over time.
Hey, Earl earlier, he was talking about the rates rises that are across the nation of some 15%. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, he said that translated through to a sort of a 0.3 to 0.4% increase in CPI. Is that about how you'd pick it?
Roughly. I mean, rates in the inflation basket aren't as big as I think people think they are. Don't quote me on this. I have to go back to my analysis, which I do have somewhere, but I think rates are like 3.5% if you're lucky of the total inflation basket. So yes, they are large. I mean, the increases that are being talked about from local government this year would be the largest rates increases since amalgamation back in '89, if we take it back. So they are quite large. They do add a little bit to inflation. I think the difficulty as well is that they come through at very specific times. So because everyone strikes rates on July 1 falls into the September quarter, that means that you'll have March and June quarters and often December quarters that are a lot lower. September is a sucker of an inflation quarter. So it sort of comes through quite sharply. And one of the things that it does make hard, just from a where's the future point of view, is if you look at that, you have some quite sort of thorny pieces there where it's quite hard from a forecasting point of view to go how much of that will sort of continue into the next year. I think the other point I'd make there is that it's not a one-off either, right? From a local government rates rise point of view, it's not like everyone does 15 and then there's nothing else coming through. So the fact that there is some quite persistent increases emerging, that does make us sit up and watch. The last point, and this is something that the Reserve Bank has talked to us about before, is the fact that we also do need to get better at understanding how households cope with inflation, not only in terms of everyone just pays the same, but what's the reprioritisation in terms of, if you've got everything that's gone up, like I say, I expect that travel falls out first and that food falls out last, which is broadly how the numbers have gone. We've seen the largest relative increase in spending from households go towards food in the last couple of years, but it is then sort of what's the priority ranking, because it might well be that you have some of these bigger things like insurance, which are a certain proportion of the inflation basket. If a lot of people are giving up on insurance, that's a whole different conversation. But if they are, then actually it should get a lower weighting. So the fact that the next reweight of the CPI is not until next year means that we'll have to wait a little bit to see, but on current expectations, yeah, I think it's about 3.5%, the contribution of rates to CPI.
And that nicely leads on to my last question. Can we launch a campaign to get overseas accommodation out of the CPI basket of goods? Because this does my head in that. What do you think?
Oh, you just don't like the Taylor Swiftflation that came through in the February month. I mean, it's one of those things. I think I would leave it in because it is what households paid. I think though this gets to the wider conversation that for the longest time everyone's used the Consumers Price Index, the CPI, all groups, as the inflation for everything, and it's not. It's good for households who buy Taylor Swift tickets and go overseas or buy fruit and vegetables and similar. For councils, for businesses who do not do those things, it's a rubbish measure. And I think that's why, everyone has become a lot more nuanced in what some of those drivers look like of inflation and how that contributes. It's also why, we did this work for LGNZ over costs. We've also been asked and have now been doing for, I think, about 2 or 3 years, specific forecasts for Waka Kotahi on cost escalation for transport projects, because again, everyone previously just sort of went, 2% is good enough. And it was sort of for a bit and then it wasn't. So I think it's more, instead of chucking things in or out, it's more just making sure we're using the right figures in the right places, which is also why we provided through to council last year a specific forecast and understanding of local government costs, because they are different. What a council buys as an organisation is way different from a household or from a lot of other businesses as well. So I think it's just the nuance and the cost pressures there that we have to look at more.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. It's really fascinating, the stuff you can show us. So I picked up about the real sharp drop-off in construction sector, and you pointed out that that's, a significant part of our overall basket of activity. So, can you give us some ideas of how we might mitigate that change, or ways that we could be smart with policies or incentives to sort of help that sector transition to something else?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll deliberately not look at staff. I say this. No, I'm kidding. But I think one of the things that you could hear, and the reason I'm advocating not to do this is, you've seen some councils do it before where they say, let's drop development contributions or similar to try and stimulate some more activity. Well, that's great until you've got to provide the infrastructure. And I think that's sort of the worry, is that just be careful of sort of the other unintended consequences you could make as a result of shifting things. Because at the moment, a lot of that challenge is going to be coming through from those interest rate costs. Like it's just a very blunt tool that really does affect construction way more than anything else. I mean, any of that work that can go on around the likes of streamlining construction activity and consenting activity and regulation is important, but I know that that has actually been something that Waipa has been quite good at over time. It's interesting, we've now been getting data through central government on the sort of processing times for consents and what have you across the country, so we now have a bit more visibility over that. I think that will stimulate a bit of conversation as we go forward, and just not from anyone's doing it right, wrong or otherwise, but more from there are improvements that might be able to be made if there are certain areas of the country that are processing stuff way quicker. Is it because they're cutting corners? Hopefully not. But, for other areas, can you go and borrow some of those ideas of how they're trying to do them and what have you? I mean, I think a bigger part of that will be the certainty that a longer pipeline will provide. So even if you do have the drops at various points, the idea that there might be more to come and some of the development work that Waipa has been doing for the future will be critical. The other bit, and probably one of the major bits, is that trying to get any Waka Kāinga Ora housing, trying to get the right government ministry or name in mind, that's a bit difficult at the moment, because they sort of, the best idea would have been for them to not build a lot when the private market were going, great guns, and now to do a lot more building now when there's not a lot. It's just that they decided they'd try and fight with the private sector and do as much as possible during it. So there's a little bit of a difficulty there. But any of that work, I think, could provide a good solid bit. The only other bit is then how, if you've got the likes of both residential and non-residential pulling back, how can that, the likes of the infrastructure work that council is still going on with, support some of those others that are out there. It's not as easy, it's not perfectly easy to go from building a house to building something else, I get that, but my father has built everything from spec homes to, big industrial units to being a concrete min in the infrastructure space. So they can do it, there's just a bit of a shift going through. So I suspect that will be a natural one that council can support, already is supporting with the investments that are going in.
You talked earlier, Brett, about insurance costs, and one of the things I know from being in civil defence was the fact that Cyclone Gabrielle and those big events have impacted us. The purchase of most of our insurance is done overseas. We purchase, and we're seen as a risk rate.
Yep.
That will continue to impact even if we don't have major events. So we will see a continuation of those rises, unfortunately, as people body in those risk factors in the future time. So I'm just asking the question here that we've seen up to 20%, I think, of interest rate, insurance rated. Do you see those to continue at that rate?
Quite probably, but both in terms of our own risk factors here in New Zealand and how climate change has been, affecting us, and sort of how much that then flows through to just, in a sense, how bad the natural disasters are. Yes, we've always had them, but they seem to be a lot more devastating and more expensive over time. I think the worry as well is that we've got a bit more or a bit better understanding of residential risk coverage in terms of, most people have got residential insurance. In fact, they often have to for their mortgage and what have you. It's just that more commercial stuff, you often don't have as much coverage. For councils, I know that's been a real big question that's been coming up in terms of cost pressures. The reinsurance market overseas is expensive at the moment because there's more coming through and that's all costing a lot more. I think the worry I sort of have alongside that is that when insurance isn't enough to cover some of this, because there's talking to people in the insurance sector, they often tell me that yes, people have insurance, they're not necessarily insured for the right amount. And I guess what I worry about, and we highlighted this to government at the time, after Gabrielle, after the Auckland floods, the fact that you had councils and government that fully funded those properties in a half-half model sort of sets an implicit precedent for the future. If you had a natural disaster here today, every single person is going to come into council and say, well, in Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, they did it this way. We expect the same sort of thing. That creates some real challenges around public policy. Now, I'm not saying for a second that government should have said, nope, stuff you're all not going to help. It is just that, with the likes of the managed retreat conversation that we're going to have around the country, that is going to become possibly quite a strong backstop for expectations. So I think that's always one of the reasons you do want to be careful with, your debt profile and similar, because out of nowhere, you could have some big obligations that spring up.
All right. Should we call it there, unless there's any last questions? Thanks, Brad. That's excellent briefing as we embark upon our long-term plan. So
all the best for your conversations.
Yep, thank you. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for making the effort. Right, I think that brings us to a conclusion. And Bill, seeing you started us with a karakia, could I call upon you to close us, please?